The police briefing room was cloaked in a silence so dense, it seemed to press down on everyone inside, a stifling weight that smothered any hint of calm. The air buzzed with an electric tension, a storm on the verge of erupting, its dark clouds gathering in the tight space between the walls. She stood at the front of the room, her posture unwavering, exuding a quiet dignity that commanded attention without effort. Her presence was a force steady, authoritative, unshakably levying he loathed with a bitterness that simmered just beneath his skin. To him, she was an affront, a black woman who dared to hold power, not just any power, but the kind that loomed over him. She was a judgeless judging that fact gnawed at him, a splitter he couldn't dislodge. He slouched back in his chair, arms folded tightly across his chest, a smug grin twisting his lips into something sharp and ugly. The fluorescent lights overhead caught the glint of his badge, a polished emblem of the authority he'd brandished for years like a weapon, unchecked and unchallenged. He didn't bother masking his contempt, not here, not among his own. His fellow officers sat around the chipped wooden table, a silent audience to his performance, their presence fueling his bravado. "Tell me something," he drawled, his voice slow and deliberate, laced with a mockery that dripped like venom. "Did they hand you that robe as some kind of diversity prize? Affirmative action, right?" A ripple of low, guttural laughter rolled through the room, a chorus of approval that stoked the fire of his arrogance. "I mean, come on, let's be real here. Someone like you wouldn't survive a single day out there in the real world without all these little handouts." Her fingers clenched around the stack of case files she held, the edges of the paper biting into her palms as her knuckles paled under the strain. Inside, a familiar heat flared danger, deep and molten, the kind she'd carried since she was old enough to understand the world's uneven scales. But her face betrayed nothing. It was a mask of composure, honed over years of swallowing barbs sharper than this one. She'd heard it all before: the sly digs, the thinly veiled sneers, the whispers that followed her like shadows. Usually they came from strangers, faceless voices she could brush off. But this was different. This was a man in uniform, a police officer with sway, a figure who believed himself beyond reach, untouchable by the very system he claimed to serve. She tilted her chin upward, her dark eyes locking onto his with a precision that cut through the haze of his arrogance. "Are you finished?" Her voice sliced the air, steady as steel, not a tremble to be found. It wasn't a question so much as a challenge, a line drawn in the sand. His smirk stretched wider, emboldened by the room's stillness, the lack of pushback from the men around him. "Oh, I'm just warming up," he shot back, leaning forward now, his elbows thudding onto the table. "See, I believe in law and ordeal justice. And let's be honest, sweetheart, people like you don't know the first damn thing about it. You sit up there behind that fancy bench, playing dress up, acting like you matter. But the truth is, you don't belong there. You never have, and you never will." The atmosphere thickened, pressing down harder as the words settled into the space. Around the table, the other officers shifted some, casting quick, uneasy glances at one another, their discomfort flickering like a candle in the wind, while others smirked in quiet solidarity, their approval a silent nod to his defiance. No one spoke, no one intervened. The silence was its own betrayal, a tacit agreement that let his venom spread unchecked. She felt it then, that burning coil of rage tightening in her chest, the same one she'd wrestled into submission her entire life. It was a fire born from every slight, every dismissal, every time she'd been told explicitly or otherwise that she wasn't enough. She'd learned to bury it deep, to cloak it in professionalism, to wield her poise like armor. But today, that armor felt thin, stretched to its limit by the audacity of this man who thought his badge made him invincible. She took a step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor, and set the files down on the table with a slow, deliberate grace. The sound of soft thud echoed louder than it should have, a punctuation mark in the charged silence. "Officer," she began, her voice a blade honed to a lethal edge, slicing through the tension with surgical precision. "You might think that badge of yours shields you, that your uniform gives you license to speak to Meadow, speak about Mel like this." She leaned in just enough, her gaze never wavering, her next words dropping low and piercing. "But let me make one thing crystal clear. I'm not standing here because someone tossed me a favor. I'm here because I clawed my way up, because I earned every inch of this position. And whether you like it or not, you will respect this court, and you will respect me." For a fleeting moment, something flickered in his eye: surprise, irritation, a hairline fracture in the fortress of his confidence, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He scoffed, a harsh bark of a laugh, shaking his head as if she'd said something absurd. The smirk stayed plastered across his face, unshaken. "Respect," he spat, shoving his chair back with a loud scrape as he stood, the force sending it skittering across the floor. He towered over her, his broad frame casting a shadow, his height a weapon he wielded without subtlety. "Respect is earned, sweetheart, and the day I bow to you is the day hell turns to ice." His words hung there, heavy and defiant, a gauntlet thrown down with relish. He stood waiting, practically daring her to flinch, to crack under the weight of his challenge. The room held its breath, the other officers frozen, some with widened eyes, others with smirks tugging at their lips. They all knew this was a game to him, a test to see how far he could push before she broke. But she didn't, she wouldn't. Instead, a smile curved her lips, not the kind that begged for peace, but the kind that carried a quiet, unshakable promise. It was the smile of someone who'd already seen the end of this story, someone who knew the ground beneath him was about to crumble. And crumble it did, within hours. The world he'd built, this unshakable belief in his own invincibility, began to unravel. The man who'd mocked justice, who'd wielded his power like a cudgel, found himself staring into its unblinking eye. She, the woman he'd tried to diminish, stood poised to deliver the consequences he'd never dreamed would touch him. He'd thought he held the reins, that his badge and his bluster made him king. He was wrong. The morning sun fought a losing battle against the thick, gray clouds blanketing Chicago, casting a muted, ashen glow over the city's jagged skyline. The streets below hummed with the usual chow-shonking horns, hurried footsteps, the distant wail of sirens weaving through the air. It was a rhythm the city knew well, a pulse that never faltered. But inside the Cook County Courthouse, a different tempo thrummed, a quiet, simmering unrest that pulsed beneath the surface, unseen by the bustling crowds outside. This wasn't the loud, flashing disorder of the streets. This was a deeper clash, a collision of wills, a war waged in sharp words and steely glares. And today, that war had names: Judge Naomi Carter and Officer Brian Callahan. The courthouse had always been a crucible, though few admitted it aloud. Within its echoing halls, justice wasn't a birthright, it was a currency, traded in whispers, leveraged by rank, race, and the loudest voice in the room. For black men and women, it was a place where judgment often came before evidence, where power rested in the hands of those who'd never tasted the sting of inequity. Naomi Carter understood this truth in her bones. She'd spent her life scaling a wall rigged to keep her out, every step a defiance of the odds stacked against her. From her first day in law school, she'd felt the weight of skeptical stares, heard the murmurs of doubt trailing her like a second shadow. Her white classmates glided into internships on the backs of their father's connections, while she scratched and clawed for every scrap of opportunity. She'd watched men of middling talent climb the ladder with ease. While she had to be flawless just to be seen, she never let it break her. She worked harder, her resolve a steel thread woven through every late night, every case, every verdict. Naomi wasn't just smart, she was relentless, a force of will forged in the fires of a system that wanted her to fail. And then there was Brian Callahan, a man carved from the system's very marrow, a white cop with a badge, a lineage of lawmen stretching back generations, father, grandfather, unclear of them wearing the same shield he now bore with pride. He'd grown up cradled in the certainty that the world bent to men like him. The system didn't just protect him, it exalted him. Never once had it turned its gaze on him with suspicion or reprimand. To Brian, law and order meant dominion, people staying in their place, going to the quiet menace he carried in his stride. His career thrived on that unspoken fear, on the knowledge that his authority could stretch beyond reason without consequence. When his temper flared, when his policing veered into brutality, there were always voices ready to excuse it, calling it necessary force, a tough job. But Naomi saw it for what it was, a flagrant abuse of power, a stain he wore like a medal. That morning, she'd been summoned to his domain, the police briefing room. To deliver a routine judicial overview, courtroom procedures, nothing more. It should have been simple, a formality. But from the moment she stepped through the door, her heels clicking against the worn tiles, she felt the shift. The air crackled with his disdain, his eyes tracking her with a predator's gleam. The room was his stage, the officers his chorus, and she was the outsider he intended to dismantle. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, that smirk curling like smoke, daring her to step into the trap he'd set. His taunts came slow and deliberate, each word a barb meant to pierce. Diversity initiative, affirmative action, special considerations. The laughter that followed was a low rumble, a tide of complicity that swelled his ego further. Inside, Naomi's heart pounded, a drumbeat of fury she fought to steady. Her fingers gripped the files tighter, the paper creasing under her hold. But her face remained a fortress calm, unyielding. She'd faced men like him before, men who saw her robe as a costume, her gavel as a prop. But Brian Callahan was more than a heckler. He was a symbol of everything she'd battled, a living testament to the arrogance of unchecked power. When he stood, looming over her, his voice booming with that final jab respect is earned. Sweetheart, she felt the weight of every eye in the room, waiting for her to buckle. She didn't. She met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with a fire she rarely let show. Her response was measured, each word a hammer strike. I earned my place. You will respect this court. You will respect me. The room stilled, the air taut as a bowstring. His scoff broke the silence. But she saw a flicker of unease in his eyes, the crack in his armor. He didn't know it yet, but the tide had turned. Hours later, as the courthouse hummed with its usual rhythm, Brian Callahan's world began to fracture. A case file landed on Naomi's desk, his name in bold. Accusations of misconduct piling high, excessive force, intimidation, a pattern of abuse stretching back years. The evidence was ironclad, the witnesses unwavering. He'd thought himself untouchable, a king above the law. But justice, the very force he'd mocked, was closing in. And Naomi Carter held the gavel. His taunts echoed in her mind as she reviewed the charges, her pen steady, her resolve absolute. He'd underestimated her, and that was his undoing. In the end, the lesson was stark. Power misused is a fragile thing, a house of cards waiting to fall. Justice, when it comes, spares no one, not even those who think they're beyond its reach. Brian learned that the hard way, his badge no shield against the consequences he'd sown. And Naomi, she stood taller, her presence a beacon, a reminder that resilience and righteousness could topple even the mightiest throne. The courtroom, once his battlefield, became her domain, and the story of his fall a testament to the unyielding truth. No one escapes the reckoning they invite. The moment Naomi stepped into the room, a wave of hostility crashed over her like a bitter wind cutting through an unguarded shore. The officers stood there, a fortress of crossed arms and hardened faces, their expressions carved tight with resentment. She could sense the unspoken words swirling in the tense air. Thick and heavy, "You don't belong here." Their silence screamed louder than any insult, a collective judgment pressing against her chest. And then there was Brian Callahan, just another figure blending into the crowd, but the undeniable leader of this pack. He lounged back in his chair, his posture radiating a cocktail of confidence, arrogance, and entitlement that made the room bend toward him. His smirk, sharp and deliberate, twisted something deep in Naomi's gut, not fear, no. She'd long since buried that, but a steely certainty, a quiet fire igniting within her. She'd known men like him her whole life, the kind who wore authority like a birthright, who sneered at the notion of earning respect, who chuckled darkly at the very idea of fairness. Then he spoke. Brian leaned forward, his voice slicing through the room, smugness dripping from every syllable like honey laced with venom. "Tell me something," he said, loud enough to ensure every ear caught it. "Did you get that robe as part of some diversity initiative? Affirmative action, right?" The words landed like a match tossed into dry grass, and laughter erupted, not from everyone, but enough to draw the battle lines clear as day. She could feel the room split, those who sided with him, their chuckles a badge of loyalty, and those too timid to defy him, their silence a shield. Naomi stood rooted, her face a mask of calm she'd perfected over years. She'd learned early that showing anger was handing them victory on a silver platter. Brian wasn't finished. "I mean, let's be real," he pressed, his tone growing bolder. "Someone like you wouldn't last a day in the real world without all these special considerations." The air thickened, a suffocating weight pressing down as her blood simmered beneath her skin. That familiar burn-florid sting of being reduced, dismissed, talked down to like she was less than human. But Naomi was a master of restraint. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Instead, she stepped forward, her movements deliberate, and set her case files on the table with a thud that echoed like a gavel. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice steady as granite, not a quiver, not a crack. Something flickered in Brian's smirk, just a shadow of doubt, a ripple in his bravado. She didn't wait for him to recover. "You may think your badge makes you untouchable," she said, her gaze locking onto his. "That your uniform gives you the right to speak to Meadow, speak about Mel like this." She took another step closer, her presence filling the space between them. "But let me make something crystal clear. I am not here because someone handed me a favor. I am here because I earned my place." The room fell into a charged hush, every breath held, every eye fixed. "And whether you like it or not, you will respect this court, and you will respect me." Silence stretched taut, a wire ready to snap. Brian scoffed, his laugh loud and brash, a forced bark meant to reclaim control. He shoved his chair back with a scrape that grated against the stillness, rising to his full height, his frame towering, looming over her. "Respect," he echoed, shaking his head with a sneer. "Respect is earned, sweetheart, and the day I take orders from you is the day hell freezes over." The room watched, waiting, every soul perched on the edge of the unfolding drama. Naomi smiled, not a retreat, not a surrender, but a slow, knowing curve of her lips that sent a shiver through Brian's gut. She knew something he didn't, a secret tucked behind her steady eyes, a truth he'd soon taste. Brian Callahan thrived on power, reveled in control, believed with every fiber of his being that he wrote the rules of this world. But he was blind to the shift beneath his feet, ground trembling as his kingdom began to crack. The woman he'd just tried to break, she was no pawn. She was a force rising, poised to become the reckoning he'd never seen coming. And in that moment, with that smug challenge, he'd lit the fuse to his own downfall. The tension didn't dissolve after that briefing room clash. It lingered, a storm cloud heavy with unspent rain, buzzing beneath every glance, every word left unsaid. The courthouse had always been a battlefield of quiet wars, where power was weighed in the gravity of a stare, the steel behind a decision. Now, the lines were drawn between two unyielding souls, Naomi Carter, resolute and unshakable, and Brian Callahan, a man who gripped control like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Men like him didn't yield easily. They prodded, they pushed, they hunted for fractures, any hint that their dominance still held sway. But Naomi gave him nothing. She'd faced him down that day, absorbed his venom, his mockery, his brazen defiance, and flung it back with a quiet strength that left him grasping. She'd walked away without a crack in her armor, denying him the satisfaction of knowing if his barbs had pierced her, and that gnawed at him, a splinter he couldn't pull free. It started small, insidious, like a snake coiling in the grass. A case meant for her desk vanished, reassigned without a word. A request for body camera footage stalled, lost in some bureaucratic abyss with no explanation. An officer she'd summoned to testify failed to show, claiming he'd never seen the notice, a flimsy excuse that reeked of sabotage. None of it was blatant enough to confront head-on, but Naomi knew the game. She'd seen it before, officers who bristled at scrutiny, who bent the law to fit their egos. This was Brian's move, his petty reminder of who he thought still ruled. But she didn't waver. She doubled down, poring over statutes, chasing every loophole, enforcing every rule with a precision that left no room for his tricks. She wouldn't let him see her sweat, wouldn't feed his hunger for power. One evening, as dusk painted the courthouse steps in shades of gray, she spotted him waiting in the parking lot. He leaned against a squad car, arms crossed, the streetlights carving harsh shadows across his jaw. He wasn't in uniform, but he didn't need to bet his presence shouted the message loud and clear. Naomi didn't pause. She strode past him, keys jangling as she unlocked her car. refusing to grant him even a glance. His voice cut through the chill like a blade. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" She froze, just for a heartbeat, then turned slowly, her eyes locking onto his. "If you have something to say, Officer Callahan, say it in court. Otherwise, get out of my way." He pushed off the car, stepping closer, his bulk filling the space. "Oh, I'll say what I need to say, Judge Carter," he sneered. "People like you think you can waltz in, flip everything upside down, rewrite the rules, act like you own this place, but that's not how it works. This city, this system, it was built by men like me, and it doesn't bend just because you think it should." Her gaze didn't falter, a lighthouse steady in a storm. "You're right about one thing, Officer Callahan," she said, her voice low and cutting. "This system was built by men like you. But that doesn't mean it has to stay that way." His jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You're making enemies in the wrong places," he warned. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a razor's edge. "And you are under the dangerous impression that I'm afraid of you." He laughed, a hollow sound, but something flickered in his ice and ease, a crack in his mask. She turned, slid into her car, and drove off, the weight of his words trailing her like exhaust fumes. Days bled into weeks, but the pressure only tightened, a noose slowly cinching. The next time she saw Brian, he was in her courtroom, a witness in a police shooting case. He sat there, polished and poised, spinning a tale so smooth it could have been rehearsed in a mirror. His version painted him as the hero, the guardian of order, every move justified. But Naomi had the files. She'd watched the footage. She knew the truth he'd buried beneath his swagger. She let him talk, let him bask in his own certainty, thinking he was beyond reach. Then she struck. "Officer Callahan," she began, her tone calm but piercing. "How long was the suspect lying on the ground before you called for medical assistance?" A twitch of irritation danced across his face. "I responded according to protocol," he said, clipped and defensive. "That's not what I asked." She pressed, his jaw locked. "I made the call as soon as I secured the scene." She leaned forward, her eyes boring into him. "According to the footage, there was a delay of over 5 minutes. Can you explain that?" Silence swallowed the room. A muscle in his cheek jumped. "I was following procedure," he ground out. "Your procedure allowed a man to bleed out on the pavement before calling for help?" she asked. Her words a scalpel, whispers rippled through the courtroom, a tide turning. Brian shifted, his exhale sharp, his composure fraying. "I did my job," he snapped. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "Then I suggest you start doing it better." The air crackled with the weight of justice. A lesson laid bare. Power unchecked breeds ruin. Brian's arrogance had built his throne, but Naomi's resolve would topple it, proving that true authority answers to consequence, not entitlement. The first time, Naomi Carter glimpsed that flicker of uncertainty in Brian Callahan's eyes. It struck her like a quiet thunderclap rolling through a still night. For years, she had watched him stride through the world-through precincts, courthouses, and dimly lit streets with a swagger that screamed invincibility. But now, standing across from her, he faltered. It wasn't just the realization that someone dared to shove back against the wall of his authority. It was the dawning truth, creeping into his bones, that this time, he might not win. Inside Naomi, a storm of emotions churned exhaustion from years of enduring men like him. A spark of defiance that refused to dim, and a steely resolve that had carried her this far. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. The tension between them didn't dissolve under the weight of that moment. Instead, it coiled tighter, a living thing stretching into the days that followed. That very night, as shadows stretched long across her office, a sharp knock interrupted the silence. A clerk handed her a folded note, an anonymous complaint, scribbled in jagged ink, accusing her of hostility toward law enforcement. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line as she read it, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. The words weren't just an attack, they were a warning, a whisper from the dark corners of power she'd long suspected existed. She could almost hear Brian's smug voice behind it, see the curl of his lip as he imagined her crumbling. But she didn't. She folded the note neatly, tucked it into a drawer, and returned to her work, her pen scratching against paper with deliberate calm. Justice, she thought, wasn't a gift, it was a fight A week later, the air outside the courthouse hung heavy with the damp chill of late evening. Naomi stepped onto the cracked pavement, her heels clicking softly against the ground. When her eyes landed on her car, a bright orange parking ticket fluttered beneath the windshield wiper, its edges curling in the breeze. She stopped, her breath catching for a moment not from surprise, but from the sheer audacity of it. The spot was legal. She'd parked there 100 times before. Her gaze narrowed as she plucked the ticket free, the paper crinkling in her hand. She didn't need to see Brian's face to know this was his doing. It was petty, a child's tantrum dressed up as authority, but it carried a message: I'm still here. I can still touch you. Inside her, anger flared hot and bright, but she swallowed it down, letting it settle into something colder, sharper, a weapon she'd wield when the time was right. Brian thought he could wear her down with these games, but he didn't understand. Every move he made only hardened her further. He was beginning to sense it, though, in the quiet corners of his mind. Doubt gnawed at the edges of his confidence. Naomi wouldn't bend, wouldn't break. No matter how many complaints he whispered into the system or tickets he slapped on her windshield. She stood like a pillar against the storm of his arrogance, and that unyielding strength twisted something inside him. Frustration festered, growing teeth, turning into a beast he could no longer control. It spilled over one evening as dusk painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. Naomi was crossing the parking lot, her coat pulled tight against the wind, when she heard a quick, deliberate crunch of boots on gravel behind her. Her pulse quickened, but fear didn't take root. She turned smoothly, her posture straight, her eyes cutting through the dim light like twin blades. There he stood, Brian Callahan, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his broad frame silhouetted against the flickering streetlights. But something was off. The cocky tilt of his head, the sneer that usually carved his face into a mask of disdain, wavered now, undercut by a raw, desperate edge. He stared at her, his breath visible in the cool air, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then his voice broke the silence, low and jagged. "You think you've won, don't you?" Naomi exhaled slowly, her weariness a heavy weight in her chest. But her voice carried no tremble. "Go home, Officer Callahan." She turned to walk away, dismissing him with the ease of someone who'd faced worse and survived. He didn't move. His words slithered out, quieter now, laced with venom. "You don't belong here. People like you." She spun back, cutting him off mid-sentence, her voice a whip crack in the stillness. "People like me, or women like me, black women like me. Be specific, Officer Callahan." Her words hung between them, sharp and unyielding, daring him to step further into the trap he'd laid for himself. Brian scoffed, a hollow sound that echoed off the concrete, but his eyes flickered with something unsteady. He had no answer, no clever retort to fling back at her. "That's what I thought," Naomi said, her tone flat but piercing. She turned again, her footsteps steadied until his hand shot out, closing around her wrist. The world seemed to freeze in that instant. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into her skin. But it was the mistake of a man too blind to see the cliff he'd just leapt from. Naomi's body tensed, her breath hitching for a fraction of a second before she wrenched herself free. She stepped back, her gaze locking onto his with a calm so fierce it burned. Brian's face shifted confusion, then a dawning horror as the weight of what he'd done crashed over him. Above them, the parking lot's security cameras hummed quietly, their unblinking lenses capturing every second of his unraveling. "You just ended your career," Naomi said, her voice low and steady, each word a hammer striking stone, "and you don't even know it yet." For the first time, Brian felt the ground beneath him tremble. His skin paled, his breath shallow as he stood there, rooted to the spot. He'd always believed himself untouchably a king in a kingdom of badges and backroom deals, but now the illusion cracked. Naomi walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the shadows, leaving him alone with the echo of her words. The fall was coming, swift and merciless, and he wasn't ready for the impact. Months later, the courtroom loomed like a cathedral of judgment, its high ceilings and polished wood amplifying the silence that blanketed the room. The air was thick, almost suffocating, charged with the electric hum of anticipation. Every seat in the gallery was claimed reporters with notebooks poised, onlookers leaning forward, their breaths held as if afraid to disturb the stillness. The only sounds were the faint rustle of paper as a clerk shuffled documents, the soft creak of a wooden pew as someone shifted their weight, and the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the prosecutor's pen against the desk-metronome, counting down to justice. At the center of it all sat Brian Callahan, a man who'd once strode through these very halls with the unshakable certainty of someone above reproach. Now, he was diminished. His uniform was gone, replaced by a plain suit that hung awkwardly on his frame. The arrogance that had once defined him, a shield he'd wielded like a weapon, had begun to fracture. His shoulders slumped slightly, his fists clenched tight in his lap, nails biting into his palms. His jaw was locked so hard it trembled, and his eyes darted around the room, searching for an anchor, a lifeline, anything to pull him from the abyss yawning before him. But there was nothing. No badge to hide behind, no fellow officers to murmur excuses in his defense, no superiors to bury his sins beneath layers of bureaucracy. Today, he was just a mounted defendant stripped bare before the system he'd once manipulated. High above him, on the judge's bench, sat Naomi Carter, her robes draped over her like a mantle of authority, her hands resting calmly on the polished wood, her gaze fixed on Brian with an intensity that could carve through stone. She didn't revel in this moment, didn't savor his downfall with petty glee. For Naomi, this wasn't about vengeance, it was about balance, about the scales of justice finally tipping toward truth. She'd waited for this not because she craved his suffering, but because she'd seen too many men like him walk free, their power a shield against consequence. Now, that shield was gone, and Brian could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, relentless and unyielding. The prosecutor rose, a tall figure in a crisp suit, his voice cutting through the silence with a calm that belied its strength. "Officer Callahan," he began, each syllable deliberate, "on the night in question, were you aware that your actions were being recorded?" Brian inhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling as if the air itself resisted him. His face was a mask, unreadable to the gallery, but Naomi saw the tense twitch of his fingers against the table, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his eyes flicked toward the screen at the front of the room. He knew what was coming, and it terrified him. "I wasn't aware of any cameras at the time," he said, his voice steady but thin, a thread stretched to its breaking point. The prosecutor paused, letting the words linger in the air, heavy with their own inadequacy. Then, with a practiced motion, he slid a flash drive into the court's display system. A soft click echoed through the room, followed by a flicker as the screen flared to life. The footage was grainy, the edges blurred by the limits of the camera, but the truth it held was unmistakable. There, beneath the sodium glow of the parking lot's streetlights, shadows stretched long and jagged across the pavement. The tension was palpable even in silence, and Naomi's figure, composed and upright, facing Brian's looming presence. Then, the moment, his hand darting out, seizing her wrist, her body pulling back with a grace that masked the fury beneath, and his voice, rough and raw, "You don't belong here." The words reverberated through the courtroom, heavier now, amplified by the stark reality of the recording. Brian flinched visibly, a sharp jerk of his shoulders as if the sound of his own venom stung him. For years, he'd spoken like that, casual, cruel, untouchable, never imagining those words could be turned against him. Now, they were a noose tightening around his neck. Naomi watched him, her expression unchanging, but inside, she felt the quiet satisfaction of truth laid bare. The gallery shifted, a collective intake of breath as every eye turned to Brian, waiting for him to squirm, to lie, to claw his way out as he always had. But this time, the walls were closing in. The prosecutor turned back to him, his voice a steady blade. "Officer Callahan, do you deny that this was you in the footage?" Brian's jaw clenched, his mind racing through years of honed excuses, half-truths he'd spun to shield himself. But the evidence was ironclad, a mirror he couldn't shatter. "I don't remember it happening that way," he said finally, his voice low, the words brittle as dry leaves. A murmur rippled through the crowd as belief, tinged with scorn. Even now, with his own actions staring him down, he clung to denial. The prosecutor didn't flinch. "So you're saying the footage is inaccurate?" Beside Brian, his lawyer stirred. a weary man with a pinched face and a voice smoothed by years of courtroom battles. My client is simply stating that his recollection of the event may not align precisely with how it appears on camera, he interjected, each word measured, a lifeline tossed to a drowning man. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her hands still steady, her voice slicing through the room like a guillotine. Memory doesn't change reality. Officer Callahan, the camera doesn't lie. Brian's eyes snapped to hers, a storm brewing in their depths, resentment, frustration, and beneath it all, a flicker of fear. He was cornered, a predator stripped of its claws, and he hated her for it. The prosecutor pressed on, relentless. Do you deny that you made physical contact with Judge Carter in this moment? Silence stretched taut, the air crackling with tension. Brian shifted, his fists tightening until his knuckles gleamed white against the dark wood of the table. No, he muttered at last, the word dragged from him like a confession. The prosecutor nodded, unfazed, and continued. And do you acknowledge that at the time, Judge Carter was acting within her professional capacity and had not engaged in any behavior that would warrant a physical response from you? Brian's breath came slow and deliberate, as if he could hold on to control through sheer force of will. I was frustrated, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The prosecutor cut in, sharp and swift. It wasn't what? Brian exhaled, the sound ragged in the stillness. It wasn't meant to be an attack. The words fell flat, hollowed out by their own futility. Naomi's voice rose then, steady and piercing, carrying the weight of years spent fighting for this moment. Intent doesn't erase impact, Officer Callahan. The crowd murmured again, a low hum of agreement, as her words sank into Brian like stones into deep water. He sat there, unraveling. The man who'd once believed himself beyond reach, now ensnared by the very system he'd abused. In that courtroom, justice wasn't just a word, it was a force, a reckoning. For Naomi, it was the culmination of every slight, every threat, every moment she'd been told she didn't belong. For Brian, it was the bitter harvest of his own arrogance, a lesson carved in the ruins of his career. Power, when wielded without restraint, invites its own downfall. The cameras had seen it, the courtroom felt it, and now the world would know it. The air in the courtroom hung thick with anticipation, a stillness so profound it seemed to press against the walls, as if the very building itself held its breath. The evidence had been laid bare, meticulously unraveled, each piece a deliberate thread in a tapestry of guilt. The defendant, Brian Callahan, had acted with intention, his choices not mere missteps, but a brazen assault on the sanctity of the judicial system. His fists had struck a sitting judge, a criminal act that reverberated far beyond the physical blow. It was a violation of trust, a spit in the face of professional decency, and now, the weight of his history, a long, ugly trail of misconduct and unchecked arrogance, stood as a towering monument to his downfall. The prosecution's words lingered in the room, sharp and unyielding. There was more than enough to convict him. Justice demanded it. Naomi Carter, the judge presiding over this moment, let the pronouncement settle into the silence. She could feel Brian's eyes boring into her, a storm of emotion swirling behind the mangler so hot it could scald, panic clawing at his chest, and a silent, desperate plea he'd never dare voice aloud. But there was no defiance left in him, no spark of the man who'd once swaggered through life as if the rules were mere suggestions. His shoulders slumped, his breath uneven, and Naomi sensed it. The fight had drained out of him like water through cracked earth. She inhaled deeply, deliberately, letting the air fill her lungs as her gaze drifted across the room. The wooden benches, polished to a gleam, stretched out before her, occupied by a scattering of onlookers, clerks, citizens all holding their breath. The high ceilings loomed overhead, adorned with ornate molding that spoke of tradition, of a system meant to uphold fairness. This wasn't just a trial about one man, it was a reckoning for every soul like him, every tyrant who'd wielded power like a club and walked away unscathed. This was justice, at long last, planting its flag on the right side of the divide. She turned her eyes to Brian one final time, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that felt almost tangible. "Officer Callahan," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade, clear and resolute, unshaken by the weight of what was to come. She paused, letting the moment stretch, the silence swelling until it pressed against every corner of the room. "You once told me that respect is earned." Another breath, slow and measured, as memories flickered through her Minda's smug lectures, his sneering confidence, the way he'd leaned on his badge like it was a crown. "You were right." The words hung there, heavy with meaning, and then the gavel descended. The crack of wood against wood exploded through the space, a sound so final it seemed to cleave the air in two. Brian Callahan, the man who'd once strutted above the law, towering over those he deemed beneath him, now stood stripped bare, forced to confront the bitter truth of his own insignificance. The echo of the gavel lingered, sharp and merciless, slicing through whatever fragile threads of control Brian had left. He sat there, rooted to his chair, the weight of the verdict crashing down on him like a collapsing wall. His chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths, each one a struggle against the invisible force pinning him in place. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as he clung to it, desperate for something solid in a world that had just slipped out from under him. But there was nothing, no badge to shield him, no authority to wield, no allies to call upon. Just the cold, unblinking reality staring him down. Across the room, Naomi held his gaze, her expression a mask of calm, unreadable yet piercing. She didn't flinch, didn't waver, and in her steady eyes, Brian saw it. The world had tilted. The ground had shifted, and for the first time in his life, he was the one trapped with nowhere to run. The courtroom buzzed faintly around him, a distant murmur of voices, spectators whispering, lawyers shuffling papers, a low hum of reaction rippling through the space. But it all faded to a dull roar in Brian's ears, drowned out by the frantic pounding of his own pulse. This wasn't how it was meant to end. His life had been a carefully constructed fortress, rules bent to his will. People cowed by his presence, fear his currency. He'd spent decades perfecting it, knowing just how to twist the system, how to make others look the other way. But not her, not Naomi Carter. She'd stood before him, a quiet, unyielding force, refusing to bend, refusing to break. She hadn't shouted, hadn't rage shed, simply fought, her resolve a weapon sharper than any he'd ever faced. And somehow, against all odds, she'd won. His lawyer leaned in, voice low and urgent, muttering something about appeals, strategies, next steps, but Brian couldn't hear it. The words slid past him, meaningless noise against the chaos in his mind. His throat tightened, dry as ash, his palms slick with sweat. His body betrayed him, trembling in ways it never hadn't when he'd stared down criminals, not when he'd barked orders from behind his badge. A creeping, unfamiliar sensation slithered through him, coiling in his gut, fear. He didn't know it at first, couldn't name a thie'd spent so long being the one who inspired it in others. But now it was his, undeniable and suffocating. He lifted his eyes to the bench again, where Naomi sat, composed as ever, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood. There was no triumph in her gaze, no flicker of glee or petty satisfaction, just the stark, unrelenting presence of truth that was worse than any taunt, any gloating smile. It was justice, pure and final, and it burned him deeper than he could bear. Then came the sound, deliberate, heavy footsteps echoing from the back of the room as the courtroom doors swung open. 2 officers approached, their boots striking the floor with a rhythm that matched the hammering of Brian's heart. His stomach twisted, a sickening lurch that nearly doubled him over. How many times had he been the one walking forward, cuffs in hand? How many times had he watched men crumple in that chair, their eyes wide with dread as he loomed over them? He'd smirked at their pleas, tossed out mocking quips about choices and consequences. Now the script had flipped, and the irony seared through him like a brand. The first officer stopped beside him, a broad-shouldered man with a face carved from stone. He shifted his weight slightly, his presence towering, but his voice carried no hesitation. "Stand up." Brian's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding together as a wave of resistance surged through him. His limbs felt foreign, heavy as lead, as if they belonged to someone else. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat choking him, the reality closing in like a noose. He didn't move. The second officer, younger, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, stepped closer. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The words were a quiet warning, edged with impatience. Brian's gaze darted to Naomi again, a fleeting, desperate spark flashing in his eyes. Anger, shame, a silent scream for something he couldn't name. She watched him, tilting her head just slightly, her expression calm but searching, as if measuring the man he'd become in this moment. Then she spoke, her voice low and even, cutting through the haze. "Officer Callahan, you of all people should know how this works." The words landed like stones, each one sinking into him, dragging him under. Humiliation burned in his chest, mingling with rage and disbelief, a tidal wave of emotion that threatened to drown him. He wanted to lash out, to roar, to tear the room apart, but the weight of it all pinned him down, crushing his will. So he did the only thing left to him. He stood. The room seemed to tilt as he rose, the officers closing in, their hands steady and sure. The first touch of metal against his wrist's cuffs snapping shut, cold and unyielding, sent a jolt through him. These were the same handcuffs he'd wielded like a scepter, clicking them onto countless others, a symbol of his dominion. Now they bound him tight and unforgiving, a bitter mirror of his past. A ripple of hushed voices spread through the courtroom as the restraints clicked into place. Every eye was on him, a sea of faces watching, waiting, judging. He could feel their stares prickling his skin, 1,000 silent verdicts raining down. For the first time, he was the one being led away, the one stripped of power. He kept his head high, his posture rigid, refusing to let them see him crack. Not fully, not yet. But as the officers guided him toward the door, his steps slow and mechanical, something inside him faltered. His eyes flicked to Naomi one last time, a fracture in his armor, a fleeting glimpse of the man beneath the mask. She didn't smirk, didn't revel in his ruin. She simply watched, her silence more damning than any words. And that was the final blow, knowing she'd won, not with fanfare, but with the quiet, unshakable strength of justice. The doors swung shut behind him, the sound a dull thud that marked the end of his reign. Naomi exhaled, the breath escaping her lips in a slow, trembling rush. The weight of the moment settled into her bones, heavier than she'd anticipated, a burden she hadn't fully braced for. There was no thrill in this, no rush of victory in watching a man's world crumble. This wasn't about winning, it was about righting a wrong that had festered too long. She glanced down at the desk, her fingers brushing the smooth, cool wood, grounding her as her mind replayed the journey that had led here. Every late night poring over files, every whispered threat from those who'd wanted her to back down. Every moment she doubted whether the fight was worth it. They flickered through her like shadows. She could have walked away, could have let the system shield him as it always had. But she'd stayed, rooted in the belief that truth mattered, that consequences had to mean something. And now they did. The courtroom began to empty, the shuffle of feet and murmur of voices filling the space as people filed out. Some moved in stunned silence, others with a quiet satisfaction, a few lost in their own thoughts. Naomi remained still, seated at the bench, letting the moment linger. Then she rose, gathering her papers with the same steady grace she'd carried through it all. As she reached the door, a voice stopped her. "Judge Carter." She turned, her eyes landing on a young officer standing near the back of the room, a black man, no more than 30, his uniform crisp, his posture uncertain. He hesitated, then stepped forward, his voice soft but firm. "I just wanted to say thank you." She studied him for a moment, taking in the earnestness in his eyes, the weight behind his words. He wasn't just a bystander, had seen it all, felt it all. The slow grind of a system that too often protected the wrong people. Her lips curved into a faint nod, her voice level but warm. "Don't thank me, just remember what you saw today." He dipped his head, a promise in the gesture. "I will." With that, she stepped into the hallway, the city's clamor filtering through the wallsharns blaring, footsteps pounding, life marching on. But for Naomi, for the system that had long sheltered men like Brian Callahan, for the countless souls who'd waited for a shift in the tide, something had changed. Power had met its match, consequences had found their mark, and justice, at last, had claimed its due. The silence of the hallway wrapped around her, heavy and profound, a quiet that spoke of battles fought and truths upheld. Naomi Carter stood motionless, her breath slow and deliberate, as she soaked in the stillness that enveloped her like a heavy cloak. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a presence, thick and tangible, sinking deep into her weary frame, threading its way through muscle and bone. This chapter, at least, had reached its end. Yet she knew with a quiet certainty that the echoes of what had transpired today wouldn't fade anytime soon. They would ripple outward, a stone cast into a still pond, sending waves crashing through the police department, the courthouse, and the sprawling city beyond. Brian Callahan's collapse wasn't merely the downfall of one man. It was a crack in the foundation of a system that had cradled him, a reckoning for those who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him, and a piercing howl against the mute, complicit hush that had let him reign unchecked for far too long. Now that hush was broken, splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces, and Naomi could feel the shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. The hallway stretched before her, a sterile tunnel of flickering fluorescent lights and scuffed linoleum floors. People brushed past them with heads bowed, eyes averted as if her gaze might burn them, others casting fleeting glances her way, their expressions hovering somewhere between awe and hesitation. Not yet bold enough to voice what simmered beneath, she didn't need their words. The truth had roared loud enough, its voice unshakable, reverberating through the corridors of power that had once seemed untouchable. Further down, near the heavy double doors at the entrance, she spotted Detective Marcus Reed. He was a rare figure in her world, one of the few who had earned her trust over years of guarded alliances. He stood there, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his broad frame leaning slightly against the wall. His face was a mask, unreadable as stone, but his dark eyes tracked her every step. As she drew closer, he tilted his head, letting out a low, measured breath that carried the weight of unspoken thoughts. "You've just painted a target on your back. You know that." His voice was a quiet rumble, pitched just for her ears, threaded with a mix of caution and something akin to respect. Naomi met his stare without flinching, her own eyes steady, reflecting the dim light like polished steel. "That was never what this was about," she replied, her tone even, resolute. "Doesn't change the fact, though," Marcus pressed, his words not an accusation, but a warning carved from experience. Callahan wasn't just some rogue cop. He was a cog in something much bigger. "You really think they'll let this slide?" She didn't need to answer. They both knew the truth. Men like Brian Callahan didn't topple without a scramble to shore up the crumbling walls of influence they'd built. She could already picture it, the hushed meetings behind locked doors, the frantic whispers over bourbon and cigars, the calculated efforts to twist the story. They'd call it a miscarriage of justice, paint him as a victim of an overzealous crusade, maybe even try to turn him into a rallying cry for all the wrong reasons. But no amount of spin could erase what had been laid bare. "Let them stew in their anger," she said simply, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I didn't come here to coddle anyone." Marcus studied her for a long moment, his jaw tightening as he searched her face for a crack, a flicker of doubt. Finding none, he shook his head again, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You don't back down, do you? Not even a little." It wasn't a question. "I can't afford to," she shot back, and he let out a dry chuckle, the sound hollow, stripped of any real mirth. "The department's already scrambling," he said, shifting his weight, trying to figure out how to handle him, how to dodge the mess he's left behind. Naomi tilted her head, her expression unyielding. "It's not their mess to dodge anymore. It's the system's," Marcus sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of years spent navigating that very system. "That's the last thing they want to hear." She wasn't surprised. There was always a legion of defenders ready to shield those who'd twisted the rules into knots for their own gain. Justice, she'd learned, was a fragile thing too often bent beneath the weight of loyalty and convenience. But today, for once, it had snapped back with a force that couldn't be ignored. Marcus glanced toward the door where, just minutes ago, Brian Callahan had been escorted out, his once commanding presence reduced to a hunched figure flanked by officers. "You think he even gets it yet?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. Naomi paused, her mind drifting to the scene in the courtroom. She'd watched Brian's face as the gavel fell, as the word guilty rang out like a gunshot. His eyes had widened, not just with shock but with a raw, Uncomprehending disbelief, a man who'd spent decades cloaked in invincibility suddenly stripped bare, the cuffs clicking shut around his wrists. The slow shuffle as he was led away, it was the first time she'd seen him look small, mortal, human. "He'll get it tomorrow," she said finally, her voice steady, but laced with a faint edge of something darker. "When he wakes up, and there's no badge, no title, no one to pull strings for him." Marcus's expression clouded, his brow furrowing as he absorbed her words. "And when he does," Naomi exhaled slowly, the breath slipping from her like a release of something pent up. "That's his burden to carry now." They both understood the unspoken truth. Some men rose to meet their reckoning, while others crumbled beneath it. Brian Callahan's path was his own to walk, but his days of standing above the law were finished. Marcus gave her a small, almost reluctant nod, then turned and melted into the shadowed corridor, his footsteps fading into the hum of the building. Naomi lingered there a moment longer, the air around her thick with the weight of what had been done. Then she moved toward the exit, craving the sharp bite of the outside world. Stepping into the city, she felt the familiar rushed honking horns, the blur of bodies weaving through the streets, the restless pulse that never slowed. Yet beneath it all, something was different, a subtle tremor in the fabric of the place. She wasn't foolish enough to think one verdict could unravel decades of corruption, or silence every crooked voice. The fight was far from over. But this was a spark, a fracture in the myth of invincibility that men like Callahan had clung to. It was proof that justice, however battered, could still bare its teeth. She'd barely taken a few steps when a voice cut through the noise behind her. "Judge Carter." She turned, her eyes landing on a woman in her mid-40s, poised and polished in a tailored coat, but with a weariness etched deep into her features. Her eyes were shadowed, the kind of tired that came from carrying a burden too heavy for one soul to bear alone. She hesitated, her lips parting as if the words she wanted to say were caught somewhere between fear and resolve. "My son," she began, her voice trembling but firm. "2 years ago, he was arrested. Callahan was one of the officers. They said he resisted, but he didn't. He was just scared." Naomi felt a pang in her chest, sharp and familiar. A wound that never fully healed, no matter how many times she heard stories like this. The woman drew a shaky breath, pressing on. "I just needed to thank you." Naomi took her in quiet agony in her posture, the resilience forged through endless nights of worry and powerless rage. "I'm so sorry for what happened to your son," she said, her voice soft but steady. The woman nodded, swallowing hard, her eyes glistening. "They let him go eventually, but he's never been the same." Something in him broke that night. Naomi wished she had more to offer, some magic phrase to mend what had been shattered, but all she could give was the truth. "Callahan won't hurt anyone else. Not ever again." A flicker passed over the woman's fauchery leaf, gratitude, a fragile shard of peace. She gave Naomi a small, tremulous nod, then stepped back, vanishing into the sea of faces. Naomi stood rooted there, the city's rhythm swirling around her, the weight of the day settling into her bones like sediment in a riverbed. Meanwhile, in a holding cell a few miles away, Brian Callahan sat alone. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, a relentless drone that gnawed at the edges of his fraying nerves. Its harsh glow bathed the room in a sickly pallor, illuminating the stark gray walls that seemed to close in with every passing second. The air was stagnant, heavy with the sour tang of sweat, rusted metal, and the antiseptic chill of institutional decay. It clung to his skin, a constant reminder of where he was, a place he'd never imagined himself inhabiting. The walls stood bare, cold and unfeeling, offering no comfort, no escape from the suffocating reality that time here stretched endlessly. Each minute a slow drip of acid on his unraveling mind. He sat rigid on the unforgiving metal bench, its icy surface seeping through his clothes, numbing his back where it pressed against the wall. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching faintly as if searching for something to grip, something to anchor him. His eyes were fixed on the wall opposite, but he saw nothing of its dull expanse. Instead, his mind churned with a magist courtroom bathed in muted light, the jury's faces stern and unyielding, the damning playback of his own voice echoing through the chamber, smug and certain. "You don't belong here," he'd said once, his tone dripping with authority, never once dreaming those words would circle back to choke him. Now he was the one out of place, a stranger in a world he'd always believed was beneath him. The truth was sinking in, a cold, suffocating tide rising in his chest. For years, he'd lived with the unshakable conviction that the cell, this fate, was for others the weak, the reckless, the ones who didn't play the game right. But now, the question clawed at him. What did that make him? A shiver ran through him, sharp and unfamiliar, teetering on the edge of fierce sensation he'd spent his life outrunning. His mind looped back to the verdict, the word guilty hanging in the air like a guillotine's blade. Final and unyielding. He'd waited for the cavalry some last-second reprieve, a chorus of outrage from those who'd always had his back, but the silence had been deafening. No one had stormed the gates for him. No one had cried foul at the injustice of it all. In that frigid, lonely cell, Brian Callahan was tasting powerlessness for the first time, a bitter, unyielding draft that stripped away every illusion he'd clung to. The badge was gone, the deference, the shield of privilege that had kept him aloft, alone with the hum of the lights and the weight of his choices. He was beginning to glimpse the lesson Naomi had fought to teach. Justice, when it came, spared no one, not even those who'd convinced themselves they were beyond its reach. And as the consequences of his abused power bore down on him, the city outside hummed on, a little freer, a little lighter, because one man's reckoning had finally begun. The realization crept over him like a cold shadow, seeping into his bones with a numbing dread that refused to let go. For years, Brian Callahan had sculpted his life around the unshakable pillars of control and certainty. He had mastered the system, learned its every crevice, twisted it when it suited him, and wielded it like a tool to keep himself firmly on the side of power, the side that locked doors and held keys. Now, though, he sat motionless on a frigid metal bench in a dimly lit holding cell, the air thick with the stale scent of concrete and despair. His world had shrunk to this, a prisoner awaiting the grinding machinery of justice he'd once commanded. The distant echo of footsteps reverberated down the corridor, steady and deliberate, a sound he'd once associated with his own authority. Each step tightened the knot in his chest, but he didn't flinch, not yet. The door boot said a sharp, electric jolt that sliced through the silencing scraped open. A chair groaned against the rough floor as someone settled across from him. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The air shifted with her presence, calm and unshakable, a stark contrast to the chaos churning inside him. Naomi Carter sat there, her posture composed, her face betraying no hint of the turmoil this moment should have stirred. Once, he'd been Officer Callahan, a title that carried weight, a name that demanded respect. Now, hearing it from her lips made his jaw clench so hard he thought his teeth might crack. She didn't belong in this grimy cell, surrounded by its peeling paint and flickering fluorescent light, yet here she was, radiating a quiet power that stung him more than the handcuffs ever could. He exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound heavy with defiance, but he refused to speak, refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Naomi didn't seem to mind. She let the silence stretch, thick and oppressive, wrapping around him like a noose. She had time, endless, patient time, and she knew it. Finally, her voice cut through the stillness, steady and measured. "Do you understand where you are?" The question landed like a fist to his gut, igniting a flicker of rage in his twitching fingers. He forced his hands to stay still, though his mind roared with the urge to shut her out, to block the truth clawing at him. He understood, God help him. He understood more than he could bear. She leaned forward just a fraction, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his throat constrict. "Do you understand what's happening to you?" The words echoed with a cruel familiarity. How many times had he sat where she was now, watching men crumble under that same question? He'd relished their squirming, their dawning horror as they realized their lives were no longer their own. Now, the table had turned, and the weight of his own past pressed down on him like a stone. His voice emerged, rough and jagged, a stranger's voice. "You think this is funny, don't you?" Naomi tilted her head, studying him as if he were a puzzle she'd already solved. "No," she replied, her tone even, almost clinical. "There's nothing funny about this." His gaze snapped to hers, sharp and bitter, searching for a crack in her composure. Then why are you here? He demanded, the words slicing through the air. She took a slow, deliberate breath, unruffled by his venom. I wanted to see if you had anything to say. A harsh, humorless laugh tore from his chest, echoing off the bare walls. Like what? An apology? Is that what you're fishing for? His hands curled into fists, knuckles whitening as he fought to steady his ragged breathing. I didn't. He stopped himself, his jaw locking tight, the confession dying in his throat. You didn't what? She pressed, her voice a blade probing deeper. His stomach twisted into knots, a storm of fury and shame raging beneath his ribs. You think this changes anything? He spat, his tone taut, barely holding back the tempest within. You think locking me up fixes the system? You think one conviction means a damn thing? Naomi didn't flinch, didn't blink. No, she said simply. But it means something to the people you hurt. It means something to the ones who watched you strut around untouchable for years. And whether you admit it or not, it means something to you. His chest burned, a fire fueled by her words, by the truth he couldn't outrun. I didn't hurt you. He shot back, his voice low and strained. Her expression remained steady, but her eyes sharpened, piercing through his defenses. No, you didn't lay a hand on me, she agreed, her voice unwavering. You didn't try to intimidate me. You didn't flash your badge like a loaded gun. You didn't degrade or torment or abuse your power, knowing no one would dare stop you. Each word landed like a hammer, cracking the fragile shell he'd built around himself. His fingers twitched again, restless with the urge to lash out, to deny. She leaned back slightly, watching him, weighing the silence that followed. And yet, here you are. The statement struck harder than he'd expected, reverberating through him like a gunshot. All his life, he'd convinced himself the system was infallibly those who ended up in cells deserved it, their fates sealed by their own failures. He'd walked the courthouse halls with his head high, a king in his domain, certain that justice bent to his will. Now, staring at the scuffed table between them, he saw how small this room truly was, how flimsy his illusions had been. His breath came shallow, ragged. You think I'm some kind of monster, don't you? Naomi's face didn't shift, but when she spoke, her voice softened, carrying an unexpected weight. I think you're a man who finally has to face what he's done. The words tightened around his heart like a vice. For years, he'd strode through life untouchable, the clack of his polished shoes on marble floors anthem of his dominance. Now, he was just another figure in a jumpsuit, stripped bare by the very system he'd once ruled. Naomi rose to her feet, her movement smooth and deliberate. I didn't come here to argue with you, Callahan, she said, her tone firm but not cruel. I didn't come to punish you either. The system you swore by is doing that just fine. She stepped toward the door, then paused, turning back to him. For a fleeting moment, her expression softened, a flicker of something almost like pity in her eyes. You have a choice, she said quietly. You can sit here and let this devour you, or you can figure out what kind of man you'll be when you leave this place. His throat burned, words trapped behind a wall of pride and fear. She gave him a single nod, then rapped on the door. It buzzed open with a harsh clang, and she stepped out, her silhouette vanishing into the corridor without a backward glance. Brian remained rooted to the bench, the silence swallowing him whole. He stared at the table, its surface scratched and worn, then at the walls, their gray expanse pressing closer with every breath. For the first time in his life, the future was a void and mapped, uncertain, terrifying. The cell seemed to shrink around him, the air growing heavier, as if the walls themselves were witnesses to his unraveling. His mind spun in a relentless cyclone, replaying the courtroom judge's gavel crashing down, the cold bite of handcuffs on his wrists, the murmurs of the gallery like a chorus of judgment. He'd felt their eyes on him, boring into his back, stripping away the man he'd been. And now, alone with nothing but his thoughts, he couldn't escape the weight of it all. Time blurred, minutes or hours slipping by unnoticed, until the sound of footsteps jolted him from the haze. The door buzzed again, and a new figure stepped inside, not Naomi this time, but his lawyer, Robert Hensley. Once, Robert had greeted him with a handshake and a grin, exuding the easy confidence of a man representing a winner. Now, his face was drawn, his suit slightly rumpled, his shoulders hunched under the burden of defeat. He sat across from Brian, adjusting his cuffs with a precision that felt forced, a remnant of the poise he could no longer muster. Brian exhaled sharply, tasting the bitterness on his tongue. "How bad is it?" Robert met his gaze, his eyes weary but steady. "Bad," he said simply, letting the word hang between them. Brian's lips twitched into a grim half-smile. He'd known it already, felt it in his marrow, but hearing it aloud made it real. "You're looking at years," Robert continued, his voice flat, professional, as if discussing a stranger's fate. "Not decades, but don't expect to walk out of here in a few months." The prosecution went all in. "And the judge, well, you know the judge." Brian's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the skin. Oh, he knew the judge all right, Judge Haraway, a man he'd once shared drinks with at galas, a man whose stern rulings he'd applauded when they'd suited his purposes. Now, Haraway's gravelly voice echoed in his memory, delivering the verdict with a cold finality that still rang in his ears. Robert sighed, glancing around the cell, its cracked walls, its single flickering bulbs if searching for something to soften the blow. "There's an appeal process," he said, "but don't hold your breath for a miracle. The evidence is ironclad. The jury didn't hesitate, and frankly, Brian, you're not the kind of guy people rally behind right now." Brian scoffed, shaking his head, the sound bitter and hollow. "You don't say." Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his expression unreadable yet piercing. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Are you ready for what's coming?" Brian's eyes locked onto his, and for once, the answer didn't come easily. Ready for the clang of prison gates, the loss of his name, his home, his identity, for the realization that the system he'd trusted to shield him had turned its blade on him instead. He'd seen it before, men in rooms like this, their hands trembling, their eyes wild with desperation. He'd smirked at their weakness, their panic. Now, he felt the same tremor in his own fingers, the same dread coiling in his gut. The lesson sank in slowly, heavy and unyielding. Justice, he'd once believed, was a weapon he could wield, a shield to protect his own. But power, when abused, had a way of turning back on its master. Naomi's words lingered, a quiet indictment of the years he'd spent bending rules, breaking lives, all while cloaked in the righteousness of his badge. The system didn't bend for him now, it ground forward, relentless, exposing the fragility of his arrogance. And as the walls closed in, Brian Callahan sat alone, grappling with the man he'd been and the uncertain shadow of the man he might become. The air in the cramped, dimly lit office hung heavy with tension as Brian Callahan sat across from his lawyer. The man, with his neatly pressed suit and tired eyes, let out a slow, deliberate exhale, his fingers massaging the throbbing ache at his temple. He looked at Brian, his gaze steady but laced with a quiet unease. "Listen, Brian," he began, his voice low and measured. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. You're about to step into a world you've only ever seen from the other side of the system. You spent years upholding, and it's going to hit you differently. You understand that, don't you?" Brian's hands clenched into tight fists beneath the table, the knuckles whitening as the reality of his situation sank deeper into his bones. Of course he understood. He wasn't just another name on a docket, another faceless soul caught in the gears of justice. He was a coper, had been, until it all unraveled. In prison, that title didn't earn him respect or deference. It painted a target on his back, bold and unmissable. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat sharp and unyielding, and forced his face to remain a blank mask, betraying none of the storm raging inside. "How long do I have?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tremor threatening to break through. "Before sentencing, I mean." 3 weeks, the lawyer replied, watching him closely, as if searching for a crack in Brian's carefully constructed armor. 3 weeks. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through his mind. That was all he had left, 21 fleeting days of freedom before the iron bars closed around him. He nodded slowly, letting the number settle into his chest, heavy and cold. The lawyer shifted in his seat, his chair creaking faintly under the movement, and then he leaned back, his expression softening just a fraction. "There's something else," he said, hesitating as though weighing whether Brian could handle more. Brian's eyes flicked up, sharp and alert, meeting the lawyer's gaze. What? The single word carried a quiet edge, a flicker of dread curling in his gut. The lawyer paused, then reached into his weathered leather briefcase, retrieving a small, folded piece of paper. He held it between his fingers for a moment before setting it on the table. "She left this for you." The room seemed to tilt, the air growing thick and electric. Brian's entire body froze, every muscle locking into place as his eyes fixed on the note. He didn't need to ask who she was. Naomi Carter's name echoed in his mind, unspoken but deafening. That simple scrap of paper sat there between them. Unremarkable in its apparencicries and slightly worn, yet it carried a weight that pressed against his chest, threatening to crush him. His pulse thudded in his ears, slow and deliberate, as his thoughts spiraled. What could she possibly have to say to him now? A final jab at his failure? A parting shot to ensure he never forgot the wreckage he'd left behind? Or maybe something worse, something that would force him to confront the man he'd become? The lawyer watched him, patient but expectant, then slid the note across the scratched wooden surface of the table. "It's up to you if you want to read it," he said, his tone neutral, leaving the choice entirely in Brian's hands. For a heartbeat, Brian hesitated, his fingers hovering over the paper as if it might burn him. Then, with a quick, decisive motion, he snatched it up, unfolding it with hands that trembled ever so slightly. His eyes darted across the neat, precise handwriting, Nami's handwriting, unmistakable even after all this time. The message was brief, just a handful of lines, but each word struck him like a hammer against stone. "You once told me that respect is earned. You were right, but so is redemption." No signature, no flourish, just those stark, unadorned words staring back at him. He read them again, then a third time, his mind scrambling to make sense of them. He had braced himself for venom, for a litany of his sins laid bare in her elegant script. He'd expected her to twist the knife, to remind him of every misstep, every abuse of the power he'd once wielded so carelessly. But this was something else entirely. His throat tightened, a raw ache blooming in his chest, unfamiliar and disorienting. He didn't know what he'd wanted from her. Maybe he'd hoped for her hatred, her scorn, something tangible he could cling to, something that would justify the self-loathing that had been his constant companion. Hatred would have been simpler, cleaner, but redemption, the word clawed at him, stirring something he couldn't name, something that made his heart thud unevenly against his ribs. The lawyer sat silently, his eyes tracing Brian's every movement, waiting for a reaction that never came. Brian folded the note with deliberate care, pressing his fingers hard against the creases as if he could seal the words away, keep them from unraveling him further. He didn't speak, didn't let the mask slip, but inside, something fractured at a hairline crack in the wall he'd built around himself. For the first time since his world had collapsed, he felt a shift, a whisper of possibility. Maybe this wasn't the end of him. Maybe, against all odds, it was the start of something new. 2 years later, Brian Callahan stepped through the rusted gates of the prison and into a world that felt alien and unforgiving. The sun blazed overhead, its light harsh and unrelenting, searing his eyes after so long in the dim, gray confines of his cell. The air hit his skin like a blade, crisp and biting, carrying the faint scent of exhaust and damp earth. He squinted, raising a hand to shield his face, and took a tentative step forward. The city sprawled before him, unchanged in its relentless rhythm, cars honking in the distance, people hurrying along cracked sidewalks, their lives untouched by the void he'd disappeared into. It was as if he'd never existed, as if the world had simply moved on without him. But he hadn't emerged the same man. Inside those concrete walls, he'd been stripped bare. Every layer of who he'd thought he was peeled away until nothing remained but the raw, unvarnished truth. He'd walked into that prison still clinging to the illusion of power, the belief that his badge, his identity as Officer Callahan meant something. That delusion had crumbled within days. In there, he wasn't a cop. He wasn't a figure of authority commanding respect or fear. He was just another inmate, and worse. He was a cop among men who'd spent their lives on the receiving end of his handcuffs. His indifference, his quiet arrogance, the realization had hit him like a fist to the gut, and there'd been no escaping it. The The first months were a brutal baptism in fear and survival. Every shadow held a threat, every glance a promise of retribution. He'd learned to sleep with one eye open, his back pressed against the cold wall of his cell, listening to the distant shouts and the clatter of metal doors. The other inmates didn't need to say it, their eyes told him everything. Men he'd once arrested, faces he'd barely registered as he'd hauled them into the back of his cruiser, now stared at him across the yard with a quiet, simmering rage. He'd thought he understood fear before, thought he'd felt it in the chaos of a late-night patrol or the adrenaline of a chase. He'd been wrong. This was fear in its purest form, constant, gnawing, a weight that never lifted. But as the weeks bled into months, something unexpected took root. The more he faded into the background, the more he became just another number in a sea of orange jumpsuits. The more space he had to confront himself. Without the uniform, without the system that had shielded him, he was forced to look at the man beneath, and he despised what he saw. The anger that had fueled him, the smug certainty that he was above the people he policed, the belief that his power made him untouchable, it all felt like a stranger's life now. A ghost he couldn't recognize. The system he'd served had propped him up, excused his excesses, turned a blind eye to the lines he'd crossed. Stripped of that protection, he saw the truth. He'd abused that power, wielded it like a club. And now the consequences had come calling. When he walked out of those gates, the world didn't care about his epiphany. His name was a stain, a headline that had faded from the papers but lingered in the minds of anyone who'd ever known him. No one was waiting to welcome him back, no job, no family, no future handed to him on a platter. He stood at a crossroads, the weight of his past threatening to drag him under. He could let it break him, let the shame and the loss define him forever. Or he could claw his way toward something better. He chose the latter, though the path was anything but clear. Finding work was a slow, humiliating grind. No one wanted to touch an ex-cop with his record. His name a whispered curse in every hiring office he entered. But eventually, a grimy mechanic shop on the west side of Chicago took a chance on him. The owner, a grizzled man named Eddie with grease-stained hands and a perpetual scowl, didn't ask questions. He just tossed Brian a wrench and pointed him toward a rusted-out engine. It was grunt work, the kind Brian would have sneered at in his old life, but now it was a lifeline. For the first time, he had to earn his place, not with a badge or a barked command, but with sweat and silence. It was exhausting, humbling, and strangely liberating. Then came the day he saw Naomi Carter again. It was a year after his release. A crisp afternoon with a sky so clear it hurt to look at. He was walking down a quiet street, hands shoved deep in his pockets, when he spotted her stepping out of the courthouse. Her dark coat fluttered in the breeze, her posture as composed and unyielding as ever. He stopped dead, his breath catching in his chest. She hadn't seen him yet, and for a fleeting moment, he considered turning away, disappearing into the crowd before she could pin him with that piercing gaze. What could he say to her? What words could possibly bridge the chasm between them? But then, as if drawn by some invisible thread, she turned, their eyes locked, and he saw a spark of recognition, the brief pause as she registered who he was. She tilted her head slightly, waiting, her expression unreadable but expectant. Brian felt small in that moment, not because of her title or her victory over him, but because she'd seen through him from the start. He took a slow, steadying breath and stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I read your note," he said, his voice low but firm every day. She didn't flinch, didn't soften, didn't offer him the absolution he hadn't earned. "And?" she asked, her tone cool and measured, a challenge wrapped in a single word. He exhaled, the air trembling slightly as it left his lungs. "I don't expect you to believe me," he said, meeting her gaze without wavering, "but I'm trying." A long silence stretched between them, heavy with the ghosts of their shared history. Then, to his shock, she nodded just once, a small, deliberate gesture. "Good," she said, her voice carrying a quiet finality, and with that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement, leaving him standing there alone. No sermon, no forgiveness, no rehashing of the past, just that one word, sharp and clear, cutting through the noise in his head. It wasn't a pardon, It didn't erase the lives he'd scarred or the trust he'd shattered, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition that he wasn't the same man who'd stood in that courtroom 2 years ago. Cloaked in arrogance and entitlement, Naomi hadn't saved him. She hadn't swooped in with grand gestures or inspiring speeches. She'd simply handed him a mirror and a choice, and he'd chosen to face the reflection. Redemption wasn't a clean slate or a triumphant return. It was a quiet, grueling journey of living with his mistakes and striving to be better despite them. Brian Callahan would never be a hero. The world wouldn't let him forget what he'd done, and he didn't deserve to. But as he watched Naomi disappear into the distance, he realized he wasn't the villain anymore either. Justice wasn't his to wield. Power had been a fleeting illusion, and redemption wasn't a gift. It was a burden he'd chosen to carry. For years, he'd thought those concepts were his to define, tools to bend the world to his will. Now, he understood. They were bigger than him, and their lessons had reshaped him in ways he'd never imagined possible. The air in New York City buzzed with its usual restless energy, a symphony of honking taxis, hurried footsteps, and distant sirens echoing through the concrete canyons. Towering skyscrapers loomed overhead, their glass facades reflecting the late afternoon sun as it dipped low, casting golden streaks across the bustling streets below. Amid this ceaseless tide of humanity, where faces blurred into one another and stories overlapped in fleeting collisions, a single moment was about to unfold only that would ripple outward, exposing the raw underbelly of prejudice and the unyielding strength of those who refused to be diminished by it. Amelia Johnson moved through this chaos with a quiet grace, her heels clicking purposefully against the pavement as she navigated the crowded sidewalks of Madison Avenue. In her early 40s, she carried herself with the poise of someone who had fought hard for her place in the world, a successful lawyer whose name echoed through the city's legal circles, celebrated for her tireless work in championing equality. Today, though, her mission was personal. For weeks, she had been planning this outing, her heart set on finding the perfect gift to mark 10 years of marriage to her husband, Derek. She pictured his warm smile, the way his eyes would crinkle with delight when she surprised him with something exquisite. For their anniversary, as she approached the Madison Avenue Jewelry Gallery, her mind danced with anticipation, blissfully unaware that this simple errand was about to plunge her into a storm of humiliation and revelation. The jewelry store stood like a gleaming fortress of luxury, its polished glass windows framing displays of dazzling diamonds and gleaming gold. Each piece whispered promises of wealth and prestige, a siren call to the city's elite. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed, almost reverent, a stark contrast to the frenetic pulse of the streets outside. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over the elegant counters, and the faint scent of polished wood and expensive perfume lingered in the air. Amelia stepped through the threshold, her breath catching slightly as she took in the beauty of it all. She wandered toward a glass case, her eyes tracing the delicate curves of a diamond pendant that sparkled like a captured star. She could already imagine it resting against her skin, a symbol of the love she and Derek had nurtured over a decade. Her fingers hovered near the glass, her thoughts lost in the tender vision of his reaction. "May I assist you with something?" The voice sliced through her reverie, sharp and cool, pulling her back to the present. Amelia glanced up to find a tall, blonde woman standing behind the counter. The employee's face was a mask of professionalism pressed into a thin line. Blue eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but beneath the surface, there was something colder, something that prickled at Amelia's instincts. It wasn't overt hostility, but a subtle disdain, a quiet assumption that lingered in the air like a faint shadow. "Yes," Amelia replied, her voice steady as she pointed to the pendant. "I'd like to see this necklace, please." The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering over Amelia in a way that felt like a silent appraisal. For a fleeting second, her eyes seemed to question whether this poised black woman belonged in such an exclusive space. The moment was so brief it could have been dismissed as imagination, but Amelia felt it deep in her bones, a familiar sting she'd encountered too many times before. With a tight, forced smile, the employee unlocked the case and slid the necklace across the counter. Amelia's fingers closed around it, the cool weight of the diamonds grounding her as she admired the way they caught the light. She could feel the woman's stare boring into her, not with curiosity, but with something heavier: suspicion. It pressed against her chest, a quiet challenge to her right to be there, to touch such luxury. She'd faced this before, the unspoken judgments, the sit-along glances that questioned her worth based solely on her skin. Yet today, it grated against her more sharply, a splinter beneath her calm exterior. Brushing aside the unease, Amelia offered a polite smile. "How much is this?" she asked, her tone light but firm. The employee's lips tightened, her posture stiffening as if the question itself offended her. "Are you sure you can afford this?" she replied, her voice laced with a condescension that hit Amelia like a slap. The words hung between them, sharp and deliberate, stripping away the veneer of civility. Amelia's heart stuttered, not from doubt she could afford it 10 times over, but from the insult buried in the assumption. She was no stranger to prejudice, but this was different. It wasn't a careless remark, it was a calculated strike at her dignity, a dare to prove herself in a space where she'd already earned her place. Swallowing the rising tide of anger, she kept her voice even. "Yes, I'm sure." The employee's eyes flashed with something close to irritation. As if Amelia's confidence unsettled her, she reached out to snatch the necklace back, her movements abrupt. "I think it'd be better if you returned it to the case," she said, her voice rising just enough to draw curious glances from the handful of other customers scattered around the store. Amelia's cheeks burned, a molten mix of fury and shame coursing through her as she set the necklace down on the velvet pad. With deliberate care, "There's no need for that," she said, her words clipped but controlled, clinging to her composure like a lifeline. But the damage was spiraling beyond her grasp. The employee's hand shot up, signaling a security guard who had been lingering near the entrance, his broad frame now cutting through the store toward them. The room seemed to shrink as the scene unfolded, the once subtle hum of conversation fading into a tense silence. Customers turned, their gazes sharpening with intrigue, some whispering behind manicured hands, others fumbling for their phones to capture the drama. Amelia felt their eyes like weights pressing down on her, each stare a silent verdict she hadn't earned. The guard, a towering man with a stern jaw and a no-nonsense demeanor, planted himself in front of her. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his deep voice rumbling as he glanced between the employee and Amelia. Before she could speak, the woman seized her moment. "This woman was trying to steal that necklace," she declared, her accusation ringing out loud enough to echo off the polished walls. Amelia's stomach lurched, the words crashing over her like a tidal wave. Steal, the absurdity of it left her momentarily speechless, her mind scrambling to process the lie that had just been flung into the open. She hadn't even slipped the necklace into her purse, or taken a step toward the door. She'd done nothing but stand there, holding it, admiring it. "I wasn't," she began, her voice trembling with indignation, but the guard cut her off. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," he said, his tone firm yet tinged with a reluctant courtesy. Humiliation clawed at her throat, threatening to choke her as she fought the urge to scream, to demand they see the truth. But she knew the optics knew that raising her voice would only twist this further against her. With a shaky breath, she nodded. "Fine," she said, the single word quivering with suppressed rage. "Let's go." As she followed the guard toward the back of the store, the weight of every stare bore down on her. She kept her chin high, her spine rigid, refusing to let them see the wound this had carved into her soul. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, a chorus of speculation and judgment. She caught fragments. "Did you see her? She didn't look like she belonged here anyway," each one a dagger twisting deeper. A young man in an expensive suit smirked as he tapped away at his phone, the flash of his camera glinting in her peripheral vision. An older woman near the counter clutched her purse tighter, her lips pursed in disapproval. The employee stood smugly behind the counter, arms crossed, as if she'd just won some unspoken victory. In the cramped security office, the guard gestured to a chair, his expression unreadable. "Sit down. Please, we need to review the footage." Amelia sank into the seat, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. Her mind churned, replaying every second of the encounter's cold greeting, the barbed question, the baseless accusation. How had it unraveled so quickly? She knew why, of course. She'd always known. It was the same quiet venom that followed her into courtrooms and boardrooms, the same shadow that lingered in the corners of her life no matter how high she climbed. But knowing didn't dull the ache, didn't erase the sting of being reduced to a stereotype in a matter of minutes. Time stretched endlessly as she waited, the hum of the security monitors filling the silence. When the guard returned, his face had softened, a flicker of regret in his eyes. "We've reviewed the footage," he said, his voice quieter now. "You didn't do anything wrong. You're free to go." Amelia nodded, the words a hollow relief against the damage already inflicted. She murmured a quiet thank you and rose, her legs unsteady as she left the office. Walking back through the mall, the weight of the ordeal settled over her like a shroud. This wasn't just about a necklace or a single afternoon, it was about the countless small cuts people like her endured, the daily toll of navigating a world that too often saw them as less. That evening, she stepped into the warmth of their Brooklyn brownstone, the familiar scent of cedar and lavender wrapping around her like a balm. Derek was there, lounging on the couch with a book in hand. His broad frame relaxed until he caught the shadow in her eyes. "Hey, what's wrong?" he asked, setting the book aside as she dropped her bag by the door. She tried to hold it together, to bury the hurt beneath a calm facade. But as she began to recount the day the employee's disdain, the false accusation, the public shaming, the dam broke. Her voice cracked, anger and sorrow spilling out in waves. Derek listened, his jaw tightening with each detail, his dark eyes blazing with a fury he rarely let show. "They treated you like a criminal," he said, his voice low and taut. "A storm brewing beneath the surface. In my city, in my mall." Amelia nodded, wiping at the tears that had escaped despite her efforts. "It was awful, Derek. They didn't even let me explain. Everyone just watched, like I was guilty before I even opened my mouth." He stood abruptly, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles paled. "This isn't over," he said, his tone resolute. "We're going to do something about this. They don't get to treat you like that and walk away." Her chest swelled with a mix of gratitude and pride. She knew Derek's loyalty, his fierce love for her, but more than that, she knew his power. He wasn't just her husband, was the owner of the mall where this injustice had unfolded, a man with the influence to turn the tide, and now he was ready to wield it. The next morning, Amelia sat across from Marcus, the security guard who had escorted her out of the store, at a small cafe near the mall. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint hum of conversation around them. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his broad hands wrapped around a steaming mug. He was younger than she'd realized, maybe late 20s, with a quiet demeanor that belied the authority he'd projected the day before. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice rough with sincerity. "I didn't want to believe you'd done it, but I had to follow protocol. When I saw the footage, I felt sick. You didn't deserve that." Amelia studied him, noting the genuine remorse in his eyes. "I appreciate that," she said softly, "but it's not just about me. It's about what happens when people assume the worst because of how I look." Marcus nodded, his brow furrowing as he stared into his coffee. "I've seen it before too many times. People like that clerk, they think they're untouchable. But yesterday, it hit different. I've got a sister your age, and if someone did that to her," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. Amelia leaned forward, sensing an ally in him. "Then help us," she said. "Derek's meeting with the store's management today. We're not letting this slide." Marcus met her gaze, a spark of resolve igniting in his eyes. "I'm in," he said simply. "Whatever you need." Across town, Derek stood in the sleek boardroom of the mall's administrative offices, his presence commanding as he faced the jewelry store's manager, a weary man named Callahan, whose nervous fidgeting betrayed his unease. Callahan had built his reputation on catering to the wealthy, his store a jewel in the mall's crown, but now he squirmed under Derek's unrelenting stare. "We're reviewing our policies," Callahan stammered, his voice thin. "It was a misunderstanding." Derek cut him off, his voice like steel. "A misunderstanding doesn't humiliate my wife in front of a crowd. It doesn't accuse her of theft based on nothing but bias. You let your employee abuse her power, and you're accountable for it." Callahan's face paled, his hands twisting together. "We'll discipline her, I swear. She'll be retrained." But Derek wasn't appeased. Discipline isn't enough, he said. This isn't just about one person. It's about a system that lets this happen. And as long as I own this mall, that system changes starting with your store. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. Justice isn't optional here. You either fix this or you're out. Back at the cafe, Amelia and Marcus mapped out their next steps, their conversation weaving a thread of hope through the pain. She thought of Naomi Carter, a name that had flickered through her mind during the ordeal, a woman who'd faced her own battles and chosen truth over vengeance. Amelia could have fought back in that moment, could have torn into the employee with the full force of her anger, but she'd held back, letting the truth carve its own path. And now, with Derek's influence and Marcus's support, that truth was roaring to life. The employee's smug certainty, Callahan's complicity crumbled when the system finally turned its gaze inward, stripping away their shields of power. As the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the city in hues of amber and shadow, Amelia stood on their balcony, Derek's arm around her shoulders. The weight of the day lingered, but so did a quiet triumph. Justice, she realized, wasn't a single act, it was a reckoning, a slow burn that exposed the cost of unchecked power. The employee would face consequences, Callahan's empire would tremble, and the story would ripple outward, a reminder that those who wield authority without accountability will one day stand alone. For Amelia, it was more than redemption, it was a lesson etched into the city's pulse. The truth, when given voice, could topple even the mightiest towers. In the bustling heart of a New York mall, Marcus stood before Amelia, his broad shoulders slumped under the weight of regret. "I'm so sorry you had to endure that," he said, his voice thick with remorse as he shook his head slowly. His dark eyes flickered with a mix of guilt and frustration, replaying the moment he'd first sensed something was off. "I knew in my gut that things didn't add up from the start, but my hands were tied, had to stick to the rules." His words hung heavy in the air, a confession of his own powerlessness within a system he'd reluctantly upheld. Amelia, standing tall despite the storm of emotions swirling within her, met his gaze with unwavering resolve. Her chestnut curls framed a face etched with determination, though her heart still ached from the humiliation she'd faced. "I get it, Marcus," she replied, her tone steady, yet laced with an undercurrent of urgency. "But this isn't just about wiping the slate clean for me. It's bigger than that. It's about how people who look like me are treated every single day. We can't just stop at an apology. We have to shine a light on what's really happening here." Her words weren't just a plea. They were a call to arms, fueled by the bitter taste of injustice that lingered on her tongue. Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening as her conviction stirred something deep within him. He'd witnessed it before with sidelong glances, the baseless suspicions, the way certain customers were shadowed while others roamed freely. "You're right," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I've seen this play out too many times. It's wrong, and it's gone on too long. We've got to do something." His agreement wasn't just a concession, it was a spark, igniting a shared mission between them. Amelia's resolve hardened like steel in a forge. She could still feel the sting of the accusing stares from that day in the jewelry store, the way the manager's cold eyes had branded her a thief without evidence. "Then we need proof," she declared, her mind racing with possibilities. "I want that store to answer for what they've done, and not just to me, but to everyone they've wronged. And I can't do it alone, Marcus. I need you with me." Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was asking and the hope that he'd stand by her side. Over the next few weeks, the two of them plunged into a relentless pursuit of the truth. The mall, with its gleaming marble floors and glittering storefronts, became their battlefield. They sat hunched over grainy security footage in a cramped back office, the flickering screens casting long shadows across their tired faces. Amelia's fingers traced the timestamps, her brow furrowing as she pieced together moments of subtle bias, a lingering glance here, an unnecessary tale there. Marcus, meanwhile, tracked down employees willing to talk. Some hesitated, their voices dropping to whispers as they glanced over their shoulders, fearful of reprisal. Others spoke with quiet anger, their words painting a vivid picture of a store steeped in prejudice. Each interview added another thread to the tapestry of injustice they were weaving. There was Jamal, a young cashier with a quick smile and a weary soul, who recounted how he'd been ordered to keep an eye on certain customers, based solely on their skin tone. Then came Lisa, a soft-spoken stockroom worker whose hands trembled as she admitted to overhearing managers dismiss complaints with chilling indifference. And Sarah, a part-time sales associate, whose sharp wit hid a deep frustration seeing customers like Amelia humiliated time and again, her protests brushed aside by those in charge. Every story was a wound, and together they revealed a festering pattern of racial profiling that had thrived in the shadows for far too long. One humid afternoon, as the summer sun streamed through the office blinds, Marcus stumbled upon a revelation that turned their mission upside down. He sat at a cluttered desk, surrounded by stacks of financial records and employee files, when his eyes caught on a name: Claire Benson, the store's manager. Her correspondence with a man named Richard Evans, a slick businessman with a reputation for ruthless ambition, sent a chill down his spine. Richard had been circling Derek's mall like a vulture for years, eager to snatch it up at a bargain price. The emails were cryptic but damning, hinting at a calculated scheme. Claire's discriminatory tactics weren't just personal BS, they were a weapon designed to tarnish the mall's reputation and pressure Derek into selling. Marcus's hands shook as he called Amelia over, his voice low and urgent. "You need to see this," he said, pushing the papers toward her. Her eyes widened as she read, her breath catching in her throat. What had begun as a single, searing act of racism against her, a false accusation of theft in the jewelry store, had unraveled into something far uglier, a conspiracy that stretched beyond the store's gilded walls. She and Derek weren't just random targets, they were pawns in a game of power and greed. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, her anger mingling with disbelief. "This is bigger than I ever imagined," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of it all. With this new knowledge burning in their chests, Amelia and Marcus knew time was of the essence. They gathered their arsenal hours of security footage, pages of handwritten testimonies, damning financial trail sand, steeled themselves for a confrontation. The day arrived with a heavy sky overhead, gray clouds mirroring the tension that coiled in their guts. Amelia, Derek, Marcus, and a handful of loyal employees marched into the jewelry store, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and unspoken accusations. As they faced Claire Benson, her icy blonde hair pulled tight and her expression a fortress of disdain, Amelia stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her voice unwavering. "We know exactly what you've been up to," she said, holding Claire's gaze with fierce intensity. "We've got evidence of your profiling, your prejudice, and your little deal with Richard Evans. This ends today." For a fleeting moment, Claire's mask slipped, a flicker of panic crossing her sharp features, but she quickly regained her composure, folding her arms with a sneer. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she shot back, her tone dripping with defiance. Derek, a towering figure with a quiet strength, moved beside Amelia, his presence a steady anchor. "You're done," he said, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "We've got enough here to drag you through the courts, and trust me, we will. Unless you want to lose everything you've built, you'd better start cooperating." His words weren't a threat, they were a promise, forged in years of watching his dreams for the mall erode under pressures he couldn't name until now. Claire's face drained of color as the reality sank in. The room fell silent, the hum of the store's air conditioning amplifying the tension. After what felt like an eternity, she relented, her voice clipped and bitter. "Fine. What do you want?" Amelia didn't hesitate. "Accountability," she said firmly. "You'll admit what you've done publicly. You'll step down as manager, and you'll make damn sure your staff gets trained so this never happens again." Claire's lips tightened, but she gave a curt nod. "All right, I'll do it." The confrontation ended, but for Amelia and Derek, it was merely the opening salvo in a larger war. They understood that this wasn't just about one store, it was about dismantling the structures that allowed people of color to be judged, dismissed, and dehumanized in places meant to serve them. The fight for justice had ignited a fire in their souls, and they wouldn't rest until the flames of change had spread far and wide. Days later, they stood before a sea of flashing cameras at a press conference, the weight of the world's eyes upon them. Amelia's heart raced as she gripped the podium, her voice ringing out with a clarity that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "This isn't just my story," she said, her words trembling with passion. "It's the story of countless others who face discrimination every day, just because of how they look. It's about justice, about making sure no one else has to feel the shame and fear I did." Beside her, Derek laid out their evidence tapes, the statements, the paper trail, each piece a hammer striking at the foundation of apathy. The crowd erupted in gasps and whispers as the truth unfolded. "We demand action," Derek declared, his voice a steady drumbeat. "This isn't personal, it's public. And we won't stop until justice is served." By nightfall, their words had spread like wildfire across social media, igniting a chorus of support from strangers and survivors alike. Claire stepped down within days, new policies were rushed into place, and the store's tarnished legacy began to crumble. For Amelia and Derek, the victory was a fragile triumph. Wounds of that day still ached, but they'd turned their pain into a beacon, proving that justice, though hard won, could prevail. Yet the journey didn't end there. Amelia's phone buzzed relentlessly with messages of gratitude and shared pain, each one a reminder of the responsibility she now carried. One quiet afternoon, as she sat lost in thought at the kitchen table, Derek reached for her hand. "You've been carrying a lot," he said softly, his concern a lifeline. She sighed, admitting the growing pressure she felt, the sense that this fight had become a mantle she couldn't set down. He reassured her with a gentle smile, grounding her as always, but deep down, she knew the road ahead stretched long and uncharted. Then came Marcus's call, his voice tight with urgency. "I've dug deeper," he said. "This isn't the first time that store's been rotten. There were complaints, years of them buried by payoffs and threats." Amelia's stomach twisted as the scope of the corruption widened before her. What they'd uncovered was just the surface of a festering wound that demanded not just healing, but reckoning. And as she hung up, she felt the fire within her flare anew, ready to face whatever came next in the relentless pursuit of a justice that could no longer be denied. What had happened to Amelia wasn't a fleeting moment of misfortune. It was a single thread in a tangled web of misconduct that had been permitted to fester for years, unchecked and unchallenged. Standing in her modest living room, the faint hum of the city filtering through the cracked window, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her chest. She couldn't just let this fade into the background like a bad dream. If the jewelry store had been getting away with their shady practices for as long as people whispered it had, then the time had come to drag every last dirty secret into the light. Justice wasn't just a word to her anymore. It was a fire, flickering and hungry, demanding to be fed. "We have to tell everyone," Amelia said, her voice cutting through the stillness as she turned to Marcus. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, betraying the storm of resolve and fear swirling inside her. Everything, all of it. The people they've hurt before, the ones they silenced, they deserve to have their voices heard too. Marcus leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his brow furrowed in thought. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much to stay naive. "I'm with you," he said, nodding slowly. "But what we've got right now, it's not enough. We need more than just our story. We need others to step up, to show this isn't some one-off fluke." Amelia paused, her mind racing. She could feel the enormity of what they were about to take on, like standing at the edge of a cliff with the wind howling below. "I'll handle it," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll get the media involved. If we can get the word out, maybe people will start talking." The next few days blurred into a frenzy of determination. Amelia barely slept, her eyes burning from the glow of her laptop screen as she typed emails late into the night. She reached out to anyone who might listen, reporters with a nose for a good story, lawyers who thrived on righting wrongs, civil rights groups that had spent years fighting battles just like this. Every call she made, every message she sent was a plea. "Help us shine a light on this." Slowly, the pieces started falling into place. One by one, people who'd been wronged by the jewelry store began to emerge from the shadows, their voices trembling but resolute as they shared their stories. There was Linda, a single mother with tired eyes and a spine of steel she hadn't known she possessed until now. She sat across from Amelia in a cramped coffee shop, clutching a chipped mug as she recounted her ordeal. They accused me of trying to return stolen jewelry, she said, her voice cracking like dry twigs underfoot, all because their system couldn't find my name. I stood there, my daughter tugging at my hand, while they glared at me like I was trash. They didn't even apologize, they just told me to leave. I felt so small, Amelia. I didn't fight back then. I just walked out, humiliated. Her hands shook as she set the mug down. But there was a spark in her eyes now, a flicker of defiance that hadn't been there before. Then there was Carlos, a weary man with a quick smile that faded when he spoke of the jewelry store. He'd gone in with his fiancée, dreaming of wedding rings and a future that glittered as bright as the diamonds in the display case. The security guard followed me the whole time, he said, his voice thick with bitterness as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. They didn't think I belonged there, didn't believe I could afford a damn thing. My fiancée was so excited, you know, and they turned it into something ugly. Just because of how I look. His fingers tightened into fists, and Amelia could see the hurt etched into every line of his face, the kind of pain that lingers long after the moment passes. Each story was a shard of glass, sharp and jagged, reflecting a truth that cut deeper than Amelia had imagined. This wasn't about a rude cashier or a bad day, it was a sickness woven into the fabric of the store, maybe even beyond it. The more she heard, the more she understood. This was bigger than her, bigger than any one person. It was a system that thrived on prejudice, and it had been crushing people under its weight for far too long. Amelia didn't hesitate. She organized a second press conference, this time with a purpose that burned brighter than her own anger. The room buzzed with energy as she stepped up to the podium, the air thick with the click of cameras and the murmur of reporters, flanked by Linda, Carlos, and a handful of others who'd found the courage to stand with her. She felt less alone but no less terrified. Her heart pounded as she gripped the microphone, her palms slick with sweat. "I'm here today not just for myself," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, "but for every single person who's been made to feel like they don't belong, like they're less than human because of who they are. What happened to me at that jewelry store wasn't a mistake. It was part of a pattern, a cruel, deliberate pattern that's been allowed to go on for years. And today, we're tearing it down." She gestured to Linda, who stepped forward, her shoulders squared despite the quiver in her lips. "They accused me of stealing," Linda said, her voice soft but piercing. "They humiliated me in front of my little girl. I was too afraid to speak up, then he thought no one would believe me. But I'm not afraid anymore." The room fell silent, every eye locked on her as she fought back tears, her strength shining through the cracks of her fear. Carlos went next, his voice a low growl of fury. "They treated me like a thief before I even touched anything," he said, his eyes blazing. "Like I was nothing. I'm done letting them get away with it. This ends here." His words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of reckoning. Amelia took the podium again, her resolve hardening with every breath. "We're not asking for the impossible," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "We're asking for what every person deserves: respect, dignity, the right to walk into a store without being judged by the color of their skin or the sound of their name. And we won't stop, not until we see real, lasting change." Her voice rose, steady and unyielding, a beacon cutting through the fog of apathy. The press conference lit a match that spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it was everywhere, in TV screens, in headlines, whispered in coffee shops and shouted on street corners. People across the country began to demand answers, their voices rising in a chorus that couldn't be ignored. The jewelry store's corporate office buckled under the pressure, issuing a hasty apology that rang hollow to Amelia's ears. They promised an internal investigation and mandatory diversity training. And Claire Benson, the manager who'd turned a blind eye to the rot, was quietly ushered out the door. But Amelia knew a few words and a firing didn't undo decades of damage. Justice demanded more. Behind closed doors, she and Marcus were relentless. They teamed up with a group of lawyers, sharp-eyed and tenacious, piecing together a case that could stand up in court. They pored over testimonies, sifted through grainy security footage, and dug up dusty documents that painted a damning picture. Every late night spent hunched over a table littered with coffee cups and legal pads was a step closer to holding the store accountable, not just for her, but for everyone. Months dragged by, each one heavier than the last. Amelia's days were a blur of meetings and strategy sessions. Her nights haunted by the faces of those who'd trusted her to fight for them. Marcus was her rock, his quiet strength a lifeline when doubt crept in. And then there was Derek, her partner in every sense, who stood by her through the exhaustion and the tears, his faith in her never wavering. "You're doing this for all of them," he'd say, his voice soft as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "And you're not alone." When the trial finally arrived, the courtroom crackled with tension. Amelia took the stand, her hands trembling as she swore to tell the truth. The room seemed to shrink around her, the air thick with anticipation. She spoke of that day in the jewelry store with suspicion in the clerk's eyes, the cold accusation that had stripped her dignity bare. Her voice faltered at first, but it grew stronger with every word, fueled by the memory of every person who'd been wronged before her. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft rustle of the jury shifting in their seats. Linda testified next, her voice quaking as she relived her humiliation, her daughter's confused questions echoing in her mind. Carlos followed, his anger simmering just beneath the surface as he described the sting of being dismissed, of being reduced to a stereotype. One by one, the others took the stand, their stories stitching together a tapestry of injustice too vivid to ignore. The defense scrambled, claiming these were flukes, errors by rogue employees, but the evidence towered over their excuses, undeniable and unforgiving. When the verdict came guilty of racial discrimination, the courtroom erupted in a quiet roar of relief. The store was ordered to pay a hefty settlement, but more than that, they were forced to rewrite their policies from the ground up, to build safeguards so no one else would suffer as they had. As Amelia stepped out into the crisp air outside the courthouse, the sun dipping low on the horizon, she felt a wave of exhaustion and triumph crash over her. They'd won. Justice had clawed its way to the surface, battered but alive. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle, though it carried a new weight. Amelia found herself replaying it all: fear, the fury, the fragile hope that had carried her through. One evening, as she sat with Derek in their living room, the golden light of dusk spilling across the floor, she turned to him. "Do you think it mattered?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did we really change anything?" Derek's arm slipped around her, warm and steady. "You did," he said, his smile soft but certain. "You stood up when no one else would. You gave people a reason to believe they could too. That's not small, Amelia. That's everything." She leaned into him, the knot in her chest loosening just a little. The fight wasn't over, maybe it never would be. But she'd learned something vital. Power could corrupt, could crush, but it could also be challenged. Every step she'd taken had chipped away at the wall of indifference, proving that justice wasn't just a dream, it was a force, relentless and real. And as the world watched, waiting for her next move, Amelia knew she'd carry that lesson forward, one determined stride at a time. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the distant hum of traffic. As Kendra sat hunched over her notebook in her dimly lit apartment, her pen scratched against the paper, each word a quiet rebellion against the storm raging inside her. She scribbled furiously, her thoughts spilling out in jagged lines, the way her supervisors looked at her like she was less than human was a scene she'd witnessed too many times before. It gnawed at her, this suffocating familiarity, as if she were trapped in a play with no exit. "I know what they're doing is wrong," she wrote, her handwriting trembling slightly. "But I'm terrified to say anything. If I open my mouth, I could lose everything: me job, my lifeline. My family depends on me. But pretending it's all okay, that's killing me too." Her chest tightened as she set the pen down, staring at the words that felt like a confession she wasn't ready to voice aloud. Miles away, Amelia's eyes traced over Kendra's message on her phone screen, the glow casting sharp shadows across her face. As she read, a spark flared deep within her, a restless, burning anger she knew all too well. Kendra's words weren't just a plea, they were a mirror reflecting Amelia's own past. She could almost feel the weight of that same helplessness pressing down on her again. The paralyzing fear of risking it all, the dread of losing what little stability she'd clawed her way to build. She remembered the sleepless nights, the way her stomach churned every time she'd swallowed her pride and stayed silent. But silence, She'd learned the hard way. Wasn't peace, it was surrender. Her fingers tightened around the phone. She couldn't let Kendra drown in that same despair. With a resolute breath, she typed a reply. Let's meet. We need to talk face to face. The cafe they chose was a modest little place tucked between towering office buildings, its faded awning fluttering in the late afternoon breeze. Inside, the clatter of cups and the murmur of conversation filled the air as Amelia pushed open the door. Kendra was already there, seated at a corner table, her shoulders slumped under an invisible burden. When their eyes met, Amelia saw the exhaustion etched into every line of Kendra's face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her lips pressed into a thin, weary line. She looked like someone who'd been carrying a mountain for years and didn't know how to put it down. Amelia slid into the seat across from her, the vinyl cushion creaking under her weight, and offered a small, encouraging smile. "Hey," she said softly, her voice cutting through the noise like a lifeline. Over steaming mugs of coffee, Kendra's story poured out in halting, painful bursts. She spoke of the microaggressions that stung like paper cuts, too small to complain about, too constant to ignore. The way her supervisors brushed off her ideas with a flick of their hands, their dismissive smirks burning into her memory. The promotions that always seemed to land in the laps of her white co-workers. No matter how hard she worked, her voice cracked as she admitted, "I'm scared, Amelia. I've seen what happens when people speak up. They don't just lose their jobs to get erased. I've watched it happen. One day they're here, the next they're gone, and no one even whispers their name." Her hands gripped the mug so tightly her knuckles paled, and her eyes darted to Amelia's, searching for something anything to hold onto. Amelia listened, her heart sinking with every word. She could feel Kendra's fear like it was her own, a cold, heavy thing that coiled in her chest. But beneath that empathy burned a fierce determination. "You're not alone," she said, leaning forward, her voice steady and warm. "I know it feels like you're standing on the edge of a cliff with no one to catch you, but I'm here, and you don't have to face this by yourself." Kendra's gaze flickered, caught between doubt and a fragile glimmer of hope. "But what can I do?" she whispered. "I need this job. My kids, they need me to keep going." Amelia took a slow, deep breath, her mind racing for the right words. "You don't have to carry this alone," she repeated, her tone firm. "We can shine a light on what's happening. We can show them you've got people behind you. And if they try to push you out, we'll make damn sure everyone knows exactly what they did." For a long moment, Kendra said nothing. She stared into her coffee, the steam curling upward like unanswered prayers. Amelia watched her, noting the way her brow furrowed, the way her fingers twitched nervously against the table. Then, slowly, something shifted. Kendra's shoulders straightened, just a fraction, and when she looked up, there was a spark in her eyes, a tiny, defiant flame. "Okay," she said at last, her voice steadier now, though it still trembled at the edges. "I'll do it. I'll speak up." It wasn't a decision made lightly. Amelia could see the storm of fear and resolve warring behind Kendra's eyes, but she also knew this was a turning point. Once Kendra stepped forward, there'd be no retreat. The days of silence were over, not just for her, but for everyone who'd been crushed under the same weight for far too long. Amelia wasted no time. She reached out to her network, pulling strings and calling in favors until she connected Kendra with a lawyer named Marcus Sharp. No-nonsense man with a reputation for dismantling employment discrimination cases. Marcus was a towering figure with a voice like gravel, but his eyes softened when he met Kendra, sensing the quiet strength beneath her nerves. Together, they sat in his cluttered office, the walls lined with books and framed certificates, and began piecing together the evidence. Kendra recounted every slight, every overlooked promotion, every time her complaints vanished into thin air. Marcus scribbled notes furiously, his pen flying across the page, while Amelia sat nearby, her presence a steady anchor. They dug through emails, unearthed patterns of favoritism, and documented the subtle but relentless ways Kendra had been sidelined. With each detail, the case against the retail store grew sharper, its edges gleaming like a blade. Meanwhile, Amelia threw herself into her advocacy work with renewed fire. She stood at podiums in packed community centers, her voice ringing out over the hum of restless crowds, calling for justice not just for Kendra, but for everyone who'd been silenced. She became a beacon for the voiceless, a woman whose own scars gave her words a raw, unshakable power. Her husband, Derek, watched her with quiet pride, his steady presence a rock she leaned on during the sleepless nights. Their small apartment became a war room of search papers strewn across the table, coffee mugs piling up in the sink as they strategized late into the evening. "You're changing things," Derek told her one night, his voice low and warm as they sat on the couch, the city's glow filtering through the blinds. "I've always known you were strong, but I'm so damn proud." Amelia smiled, resting her head against his shoulder, drawing strength from his unwavering belief in her. As Kendra's case gained momentum, the media latched onto it like hounds on a scent. Reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing outside the store's gleaming glass doors, drawing stark parallels between Kendra's fight and Amelia's own battle against a jewelry empire years before. The public's outrage swelled, a tidal wave of anger crashing over social media and spilling into the streets. Protesters gathered with handmade signs, their chants echoing through the concrete canyons. "Justice for Kendra," the store's management, a group of slick-suited executives with tight-lipped smiles, tried to bury the story. They issued vague statements about internal reviews and commitment to diversity, but their words rang hollow. This time, the world was watching, and their old tricks wouldn't work. The courtroom was a pressure cooker when the trial began. The air buzzed with tension, thick with the rustle of reporters' notebooks and the murmur of onlookers crammed into the gallery. Outside, the crowd swelled, their signs bobbing like a sea of defiance. Kendra took the stand, her hands trembling as she gripped the microphone, but her voice cut through the room like a blade. "I worked hard," she said, her eyes blazing with a fire that hadn't been there months ago. "I earned those opportunities, just like everyone else, but they never gave me a chance and not a fair one. And that's wrong." The defense lawyers, a trio of sharp-eyed men in crisp suits, tried to twist her words. They painted her as bitter, a malcontent grasping for excuses. But the evidence was a mountain. They couldn't climb testimonies from co-workers like Sarah, a soft-spoken cashier who'd seen the same favoritism firsthand, and Jamal, a stockroom worker whose quiet fury matched Kendra's own. Emails and records laid bare a system built to keep people like them down. When the verdict came, the room held its breath. The jury foreman's voice was steady, guilty. The store was ordered to pay a hefty settlement, but the real victory was in the mandates that followed overhauled policies, mandatory training, a reckoning they couldn't dodge. Kendra's win wasn't just hers, it was a thunderclap, a warning to every company that justice wasn't a suggestion, it was a demand. As they left the courthouse, Kendra's smile broke through the tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered to Amelia, her voice thick with gratitude. Amelia pulled her into a hug, the weight of their triumph settling over them like a warm blanket. "You did this," she murmured. "I just showed you the way." The aftermath rippled far beyond the courtroom. Headlines screamed for weeks, igniting debates about workplace fairness and the cost of unchecked power. Companies nationwide scrambled to audit their own practices, terrified of being the next domino to fall. For Amelia, it was a milestone, but not an end. Late one night, as she and Derek sat in the stillness of their home, she voiced the dream that had been simmering in her mind. "I want to build something bigger," she said, her eyes alight with possibility. "An organization to help people like Kendra, people who don't have the tools to fight. We could take on the whole system." Derek grinned, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You're the one to do it," he said simply. And as the city hummed outside, Amelia felt the road ahead unfurlong, treacherous, but hers to conquer. The lesson was clear. Power abused would face consequences, and justice, once stirred, could never be silenced again. The air in Amelia's small apartment felt thick with purpose that evening, the kind of restless energy that hums beneath the skin when a dream starts taking shape. Papers sprawled across the dining table like fallen leaves, each one scribbled with fragments of her vision, a sanctuary for those crushed under the weight of discrimination, a place where legal aid, emotional solace, and raw, unyielding courage could weave together into something unbreakable. She didn't want just another law firm with polished desks and cold handshakes. She imagined a movement, a blazing signal fire for anyone who'd ever felt the sting of injustice, based on their skin, their voice, their very existence. Her pen scratched furiously against the notepad, her 100th idea spilling out in a rush of ink, as if pausing might let the dream slip through her fingers. Across the room, Derek glanced up from his book, his eyes catching the faint glow of determination radiating from her. "You've been busy," he said, his voice warm, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he nodded toward the chaos of notes. Amelia looked up, her eyes alight with a fire that hadn't dimmed despite the late hour. "I have," she replied, her words buzzing with excitement. "I think I'm ready to build this thing, Derek. But I can't do it alone. I'm going to need help." He rose from his chair, crossing the room with that steady, quiet confidence she'd always leaned on, and peered over her shoulder at the scattered pages. "You'll get it," he assured her, his tone solid as stone. "There are people out there who crave change just as much as you do. All you have to do is reach out." His words landed like a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of doubt. She nodded, gratitude swelling in her chest. Derek was her anchor, always seeing the strength in her even when she couldn't. He was right, she didn't have to carry this alone. Over the next few weeks, Amelia threw herself into the fray, her phone buzzing incessantly as she dialed up lawyers, activists, community organizers, and even a few steadfast allies who'd stood shoulder to shoulder with her during her own battle against that jewelry store years ago. That fight had been personal, a jagged wound carved by humiliation and defiance, but it had forged her into something fiercer. Now, she was turning that fire outward, and the response was a tidal wave she hadn't dared hope for. People didn't just nod polite like he leapt in, voices crackling with eagerness, hands outstretched to join something real, something that could shift the world even a fraction toward fairness. Word rippled through the city like a current, drawing in strangers who'd heard whispers of her plan. Soon, she was hosting gatherings wherever space allowed, cramped conference rooms with flickering lights, cozy living rooms thick with the smell of coffee, bustling cafes where conversations competed with the clatter of dishes. Each meeting pulsed with urgency as they hashed out strategies, pooled resources, and set their sights on a goal that loomed larger with every voice added. Amelia was adamant. This wouldn't be some hollow nonprofit with glossy pamphlets and empty promises. She envisioned what she tentatively called the Justice Collective, a living, breathing force that wouldn't just patch up wounds, but demand the systems causing them be torn down and rebuilt. Justice wasn't a bandage, it was a reckoning, a lesson in consequences for those who wielded power like a weapon. The launch came faster than she'd expected, a whirlwind of effort from a small but ferocious crew who'd rallied around her. They rented a community center, its walls scuffed and worn but brimming with history, and sent out an open call to anyone hungry to learn more. That night, the hall swelled with a sea of faces, sighing and old, weathered and hopeful. Every shade of humanity pressed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters scribbled furiously in notebooks, their pens racing to catch the story unfolding. Lawyers in crisp suits mingled with activists in faded tees, their eyes sharp with purpose. Some wandered in out of sheer curiosity, drawn by the buzz, while others carried the weight of their own scar stories of being dismissed, demeaned, or outright attacked for who they were. Yet they all shared a hunger, a bone-deep need to be part of something that could crack the world open and let light in. When Amelia stepped onto the stage, her heart thundered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of nerves and awe. The crowd stretched before her, a tapestry of lives stitched together by this single moment, and she felt a tidal surge of gratitude for every soul who'd lifted her to this point. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied, ringing out clear and strong. "Thank you all for being here," she began, emotion threading through every syllable. "The Justice Collective started as my own fight for dignity, for respect, but it's grown into something so much bigger. We're here because we believe no one should face injustice alone. We're here because we know change doesn't come easy or fast, but it comes when we stand together." The room erupted, applause crashing like waves against a shore, the air crackling with a shared electric hope. "This is just the start," she pressed on, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "We've got a long road ahead, but with every case we take, every voice we lift, every system we force to answer for itself, we're building a world where justice isn't just a dream, it's a reality." A world where no one's judged for their skin, their gender, their roots, or their beliefs. By the time she stepped down, the collective had swelled, with new blood volunteers scribbling their names on lists, donations piling up in crumpled bills and checks, supporters whispering plans to spread the word further. It was raw, messy, and alive. A chord struck deep in the hearts of people who'd waited too long for someone else to fix what was broken. In the months that followed, the Justice Collective took root and grew like wildfire. Amelia and her team plunged into battles big and small: workplace bias that left people invisible, housing scams that stole homes from the vulnerable, police misconduct that turned trust into fear. Each win was a brick laid in their foundation. Every policy they reshaped a testament to what Collective will could do. But the path was jagged, strewn with thorns. For every triumph, there were nights of grinding frustration, cases snarled in legal red tape, or pushback from corporations with deep pockets and deeper arrogance. Some fights stretched on for years, testing her resolve until it felt like it might snap. During one brutal class action suit against a retail giant accused of systemic discrimination, Amelia felt the weight of it all bearing down. The company's lawyers were sharks, circling with endless motions and smears, their resources a bottomless well while her team scraped by on grit and borrowed time. One night, after a grueling day in court where every word felt like wading through mud, she stumbled home, exhaustion dragging at her bones. Derek was there, waiting in the dim glow of their living room. And the moment he saw her, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow, knew the storm had hit hard. She collapsed onto the couch, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. Derek, this case seat's too big. They're too strong. It feels like we're swinging at shadows, and they're always one step ahead." He sat beside her, his hand finding her shoulder, warm and steady against the chaos in her mind. "You've come so far, Amelia," he said softly, his words a tether pulling her back. "Don't lose sight of what you've built. These fights take time, but you're in the right one. That's what counts." She exhaled, long and shaky, resting her head against the cushion as his words sank in. "I just don't want it to fail them," she murmured. "So many people are counting on us." Derek's voice was gentle but firm. "You won't. You're not alone in the sigh. You've got a team that believes in you in this. Trust them. Trust yourself." A flicker of hope sparked in her chest, faint but stubborn, and she clung to it. He was right. She couldn't let the grind erase the why behind it all. Months later, that relentless case cracked open. After years of clawing through the muck, the court ruled for the plaintiffs, pinning the retailers' discriminatory practices to the wall for all to see. The victory roared through the collective like a thunderclap, not just for the people it freed, but for the message it carved into the world. Power wasn't untouchable. No corporation, no matter how towering, could dodge the consequences of its actions when people refused to stay silent. It was a lesson in justice, sharp and unyielding, that abusing authority came with a price, and those who paid it weren't always the ones who deserved to. For Amelia, it was a reminder of why she'd started, a beacon cutting through the doubt. The collective wasn't just fighting battles, it was rewriting the rules, one hard one step at a time.